Brigham the Cave Dog by H.C. Hovey. Coffee Break Collection 29. Dogs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by April 6090, California, United States of America. Brigham the Cave Dog. Many a dog will bravely go through tangled forests, swollen streams, and mountain ravines. But when it comes to following his master down into a dark and silent cave, that is another matter. Never until recently have I known one that did not plainly regard it as a very solemn performance. Jack, the old house-hound, the volunteer escort of visitors to Mammoth Cave, is no exception to this rule. He watches the negro guides trim the lamps and bunch them on canes ready for distribution. When the bell rings, he leads the company among the tall trees to the mouth of the cavern. On he goes, under the bright cascade, and beneath the black ledges, as far as the iron gate. He peers a moment between the bars, as if overcome by his awe of the unknown. Then, when the gate is unlocked and all have gone in, his duty is done, and he trots home again, absolutely refusing to go beyond the last glimpse of daylight. Underground researches was very amusing. But Jack has a companion in his old age, a common yellow cur, the hero of this true story, William, a wag, as well as a first-rate guide, explained to me the odd name given to the new dog.
"We call him Brigham, 'cause he's young, you know."
This creature is remarkable for one thing, and that is his fondness for life below ground. He seems at home among the elves and gnomes, and appears to have no fear of darkness. The two dogs trot side by side as far as the iron gate, but there they part. Jack, as usual, returns to the hotel, but Brigham advances, pushing ahead of the guides, choosing his own path, digressing now and then, yet always returning in safety to the light of the lamps. Brigham and I became fast friends during my fortnight's stay at Mammoth Cave last summer. The gentle dignity with which he sought to aid my underground researches was very amusing. How sedately he examined each of the huge salt-pepper vats, 3 in the rotunda and 8 in the amphitheater. It really seemed but an act of common politeness to explain to him that these were historical relics, and that the salt-pepper made here was carried by oxen and pack-mules to Philadelphia to be used in making gunpowder during the war with Great Britain in 1812. Each striking object, the grotesque stalactites, the uncouth rocks, the mysterious star-chamber, which commanded the dog's attention as well as our own. Usually a silent observer, he howled piteously, while the guide told the melancholy story of the consumptive's cottage. This is a stone building, nearly a mile within the cave, and is one of 15 huts, in which several invalids, tempted by the great purity of the cave atmosphere and the uniformity of temperature, just 54 degrees Fahrenheit at all seasons, sought to regain their health. Alas, in vain! They every one died, like the shrubs they planted about their abodes. I suppose Brigham did not understand all this, but probably he was affected by the deserted and desolate appearance of the place, or by the lugubrious tones of the guide. Brigham was a great favorite with the manager of the cave, who particularly warned us not to lose him, for it was feared the dog would be unable to find his way out again. Other curs that had been left behind invariably stayed in the place where they had become lost, not daring to stir, but yelping and howling till help came. The dreaded accident happened at last. We went one day on what is called the long route to the end of the cave, said to be 9 miles from the entrance, and Brigham went with us. We left the main cave at the giant's coffin by an arched way, leading among some pits, the most famous of which has long been known as the bottomless pit. My guide, however, measured it and found that it was exactly 105 feet deep. There are 6 pits in all at this place, 2 of them lately discovered. We named them Scylla and Charybdis, because in trying to keep out of one, you are in danger of falling into the other. These we measured, finding them to be more than 200 feet deep. Brigham did not like the pits very well. It was only by much coaxing that we led him across the narrow bridge thrown over the bottomless pit. But indeed we all were glad to get away from that dangerous place. Our path next led us down still farther, among great rocks, into such a crooked labyrinth that I think it will puzzle some of my readers to trace it on the map, although this is correctly drawn. We went through the Fat Man's Misery and entered River Hall, where there are several deep lakes. Presently we came to Echo River, about 30 feet deep, from 20 to 200 feet, and 3/4 of a mile long. Getting into a small boat, we paddled our way over the clear, cold water, waking the echoes from the steep, rocky walls, Brigham helping with some lively barking. Presently we landed on a nice sandy beach at the farther end. Thence we went on, by widening avenues not marked on the map, to the terminus of the long route, and then we started back again. Poor Brigham became very tired, and cared less for the lovely arches of flower-like crystals than for some cozy nook where he might curl down for a nap. At length, after taking lunch with us in Washington Hall, he started in chase of a cave rat, and probably availed himself of the chance to take his siesta. At all events he disappeared, and made no answer to our calls.
"Perhaps he has gone ahead to Echo River," said I, "and is waiting for us there."
"Like enough," said William the guide. "I had not thought of that." But no bounding form or joyful bark welcomed our approach. The echoes answered our calls until it seemed as if 1,000 voices were crying, "Brigham! Brigham!" in every conceivable tone, from the softest whisper to the deepest bass. And our whistling was, in like manner, repeated until it seemed as if all the spirits in the cave had been let loose for an Oelian concert. Plainly the dog was lost. William thought Brigham might track us as far as the river, but that on reaching the water he surely would lose the scent, and would not try to swim across. Lighting a freshly filled lamp, William set it on a ledge, so that in case the dog should come thus far he might not feel too lonely. Sadly we returned to the hotel, where our announcement of the loss caused a sensation, the ladies especially declaring it perfectly dreadful to leave the poor thing alone in that horrible cave all night, as if it were darker there at midnight than at noon. Early the next morning a party of explorers crossed Echo River, and were met by Brigham. The guide reasoned with him as one might reason with a runaway child, and tenderly took him in his arms aboard the boat. Alas, the warnings were wasted, for almost as soon as we had landed, that capricious cave dog disappeared again, and as before refused to obey our loudest summons. Compassion was now mixed with indignation, and we left him to his fate. Nothing was seen of him all that day, and this time of deliberate choice he remained a second night underground. And now comes, perhaps, the strangest part of my story. On the following morning, Jack, too, was missing. The guides had to dispense with their customary canine escort. On arriving, however, at the iron gate, 300 yards within the cave, they found Jack just outside and Brigham behind the bars, and there the dogs stood, wagging their tails and apparently exchanging the news. Our curiosity led us to examine Brigham's tracks, to see by what route he had found his way back. Beginning at the Echo River, we had no difficulty in seeing that he had, step by step, followed our trail, his only guide, of course, being the sense of smell. Here his tracks were deeply printed in soft mud, and there more sharply defined on the mellow banks of nitrous earth, less distinctly along ridges of sand or over heaps of stone, or up steep stairways. Thus Brigham had followed us through darkness deeper than that of midnight, along the narrow beach of Lake Lethe, across the treacherous natural bridge spanning the river Styx, up to the galleries overhanging the Dead Sea, through the wild confusion of Bandit's Hall, and by many a spot where one misstep would have sent the poor lonely creature plunging downward in darkness to inevitable death. It will be remembered that we had gone in past the giant's coffin by the arched way among the deep pits and through the mazes leading to River Hall, but we had come out by a newly discovered mode of exit, through an intricate set of fissures, known, on account of its winding nature, as the corkscrew. We preferred this because it saved 1.5 miles of travel. Our 4-footed friend, pursuing the freshest scent, went, of course, up the corkscrew. The opening is too irregular to be called a pit or shaft, yet it winds upward for a distance, vertically, of about 150 feet, but fully 500 feet as one climbs, creeping through crevices, twisting through auger holes, and scaling precipitous rocks scattered in the wildest confusion imaginable. 3 ladders have to be mounted in threading this passage. One emerges at last on the edge of a cliff, overlooking the main cave, and down which he clambers to the level floor, where the road runs smoothly along to the iron gate, 1/4 mile distant. Only think of it! Through all this intricate and hazardous pass, where, without a guide, we should have found it difficult to make our way even with lamps and a map of the cave, that yellow dog had safely gone alone. He offered no explanation of his proceedings, nor told us what motive prompted his independent explorations. But that was his affair, not ours. We honored him as a hero, and obtained for him from the manager, Mr. Francis Clate, the freedom of the cave for the rest of his life. The fact should be mentioned by contrast with this perfect and fearless operation of instinct, that expert cave hunters find themselves nearly helpless if left alone far within the cave and destitute of a light. The rule for any one so unfortunately situated is for him to stay where he is as contentedly as he can, until assistance comes, which is sure to be within a few hours. Several tales are told of persons whose reason has been lost under such circumstances, and although I know of no instance in which life itself has been sacrificed, it can readily be seen that it might be imperiled. The stories one occasionally reads of novices finding their way out unaided by lights are to be discredited. An exploit of that nature would tax the resources of the most expert guide. The cases are extremely rare in which it has been done, even by the guides themselves. One of the most thrilling stories I ever heard was told to me by old Matt, a colored man, who has served as a guide for more than 40 years, and who is supposed to know every nook and corner of the explored parts of Mammoth Cave. There had been a marriage in the Gothic chapel, a grand rocky chamber far within the cave. A maiden who had promised her mother never to marry any man on the face of the earth had kept the letter of her pledge, and yet in this underground spot had wedded the man of her choice. After the wedding there was wine, and then some of the young men took a ramble through the cave. Old Matt was at work in the vicinity of the great pits when he heard them coming with song and with shout. Those were Ku Klux Klan's times, and the ex-slave thought that discretion was the better part of valor, and accordingly he hid in a crevice, put his lamp out, and quietly waited for the revelers to pass by. On coming forth from his hiding place, he found that he had no matches, and therefore could not relight his lamp. The hour was late, and the next day was Sunday. He feared lest a long time might elapse before help should come, and therefore determined to make his way out in the dark. Feeling cautiously along with his staff, he went safely until it suddenly dropped into a pit of unknown depth. Brave as Matt is known to be, he fell in a swoon, and lay, no one knows how long, on the very edge of that horrible chasm. On coming to, he collected his wits as well as he could, and felt with his hands for the path. He presently found it, and proceeded on his perilous journey, making his way finally to the surface. Old Matt told me this story himself, as he and Brigham and I sat side by side on the brink of the abyss where the faithful guide so narrowly escaped finding a tomb, and as I listened I was glad that the lamps were burning brightly. End of Brigham the Cave Dog.
How do you find this book? Any thoughts about the book or the author? Any suggestion for improvement? Please take a moment to share your thoughts in a comment. If you like it, share it with your friends who might enjoy it as well. Subscribe to keep in touch. Visit CompleteAudiobooks.com for more quality content.
The Cur Dog, from Anecdotes of Dogs by Edward Jesse, Esquire. Coffee Break Collection 29. Dogs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rowan Pattigill. The Cur Dog. Almost every dog which is crossbred is ranked as a cur dog or mongrel, but that which is specially described by Yaller is the shepherd's dog crossed with the terrier and is nearly smooth, but he is considerably longer in the legs in proportion to the size of his body, is stronger in the make, has half-pricked ears, is generally black and white, although sometimes all black, and has rather a short tail. In the north of England and southern counties of Scotland, great attention is paid to the breeding of this dog, and to breaking him in for driving and tending cattle, which he does with great intelligence. Indeed, his sagacity in everything is uncommonly great, and he is very trusty. These dogs bite very keenly, and always make their attack at the heels of cattle, who on this account, having no defence against them, are quickly compelled to run. The cur has long, and somewhat deservedly, obtained a very bad name as a bully and a coward, and certainly his habit of barking at everything that passes and flying at the heels of the horse renders him often a very dangerous nuisance. He is, however, valuable to the cottager. He is a faithful defender of his humble dwelling, no bribe can seduce him from his duty, and he is useful and an effectual guard over the clothes and scanty provisions of the labourer, who may be working in some distant part of the field. All day long he will lie upon his master's clothes, seemingly asleep, but giving immediate warning of the approach of a supposed marauder. He has a propensity, when at home, to fly at every horse and every strange dog, and of young game of every kind there is not a more ruthless destroyer than the village cur. The following story is strictly authentic. Not long ago, a young man, an acquaintance of Lord Fife's coachman, was walking, as he had often done, in his lordship's stables at Banff. Taking an opportunity when the servants were not regarding him, he put a bridle into his pocket. A Highland cur that was generally about the stables observed the theft, and immediately began to bark at him, and when he got to the stable door would not let him pass, but held him fiercely by the leg to prevent him. As the servants had never seen the dog act thus before, and the same young man had been often with them, they could not imagine what could be the reason of the dog's conduct. However, when they perceived the end of the valuable bridle peeping out of the young man's pocket, they were able to account for it, and on his giving it up the dog let go his hold and allowed him to pass. "I recollect," says Mr. Hall, "when I passed some time at Viscount Arbuthnot's at Hatton, in the parish of Marykirk, one of his lordship's estates, that when the field servants went out one morning they found a man whom they knew, and who lived a few miles distant, lying on the road a short way from the stables, with a number of bridles, girths, etc., etc., near him, and the house-dog, which was of the Highland breed, lying also at his ease, holding the seat of the man's breeches in his mouth. The man confessed this crime, and told them that the dog had struggled with him and held him in that position for 5 hours, but that immediately after the servants came up, he let go his hold." The following anecdote is well known. In London, a few years since, a box properly directed was sent to a merchant shop to lie there all night and be shipped off with the other goods next morning. A dog which accidentally came into the shop with a customer, by smelling the box and repeatedly barking in a peculiar way, led to the discovery that it did not contain goods, but a fellow who intended to admit his companions and plunder the shop in the night time. John Lang, Esquire, Deputy Sheriff of Selkirk, had a female cur big with pups, which on one occasion, when out in the fields attending the cattle, was taken in travail and pupped on the moor. She concealed her litter in a whin bush, brought the cattle home at the usual time with the utmost care, and having delivered her charge, returned to the moor and brought home the puppies one by one. Mr. Lang, with that humanity which marks his character, preserved the whole litter, that he might not give the least cause of pain to so faithful and so affectionate an animal. In Lambeth Church there is a painting of a man with a dog on one of the windows. In reference to this, we learn by tradition that a piece of ground near Westminster Bridge, containing 1 acre and 19 roods, named Pedlar's Acre, was left to this parish by a pedlar, upon condition that his picture and that of the dog should be perpetually preserved on painted glass in one of the windows of the church, which the parishioners have carefully performed. The time of this gift was in 1504, when the ground was let at 2 shillings 8 pence per annum, but in the year 1762 it was let on lease at £100 per year, and a fine of £800, and is now worth more than £250 yearly. The reason alleged for the pedlar's request is that, being very poor and passing the aforementioned piece of ground, he could by no means get his dog away, which kept scratching at a particular spot of earth until he attracted his master's notice, who, going back to examine the cause and pressing with his stick, found something hard, which on a nearer inspection proved to be a pot of gold. With part of this money he purchased the land and settled in the parish, to which he bequeathed it on the conditions aforesaid. It was with pleasure, observes Mr. Taylor, in his general character of the dog, that I watched the motions of a grateful animal belonging to one of the workmen employed at Portsmouth dockyard. This man had a large cur dog who regularly every day brought him his dinner upwards of a mile. When his wife had prepared the repast, she tied it up in a cloth and put it in a hand-basket. Then, calling Trusty, for so he was properly named, desired him to be expeditious and carry his master's dinner, and be sure not to stop by the way. The dog, who perfectly well understood his orders, immediately obeyed, by taking the handle of the basket in his mouth, and began his journey. It was laughable to observe that, when tired by the way, he would very cautiously set the basket on the ground, but by no means would suffer any person to come near it. When he had sufficiently rested himself, he again took up his load, and proceeded forward until he came to the dock gates. Here he was frequently obliged to stop and wait with patience until the porter, or some other person, opened the door. His joy was then visible to everyone. His pace increased, and with wagging tail, expressive of his pleasure, he ran to his master with the refreshment. The caresses were then mutual, and after receiving his morsel as recompense for his fidelity, he was ordered home with the empty basket and plates, which he carried back with the greatest precision, to the high diversion of all spectators. Some years since, a distiller who lived in Chelsea in Middlesex had a middle-sized brown cur dog, crossed with a spaniel, which had received so complete an education from the porter that he was considered a very valuable acquisition. This porter used generally to carry out the liquors to the neighbouring customers in small casks tied up in a coarse bag, or put in a barrow, and whenever the man thought proper to refresh himself, which was frequently the case, he would stop the barrow, and calling Basto, which was the dog's name, in a very peremptory manner bid him mind the bag, and away he went to drink, and frequently left the barrow in the middle of the street. Basto always rested near his trust, and sometimes apparently asleep, which induced many idle people, who, seeing a bag in the road without an owner, to attempt stealing the same. But no sooner had they endeavoured to decamp with the prize, than this vigilant creature flew at them with such outrage as obliged them immediately to relinquish the undertaking, and glad were they to escape with a few bites and whole bones, and leave the tempting bait to catch other dishonest rogues as it had done them. One day a person, having particular business with the master, which required dispatch, went to the distillery adjoining the dwelling-house, thinking it very likely he might meet him there, giving orders to the servant, and finding the outward door open, walked into the still-room, but no sooner had he gone a few steps than a fierce growl assailed his ears, and almost imperceptibly he was pinioned by fear to the wall. The affrighted person called loudly for help, but the family being at the other part of the house, his cries were fruitless. The generous animal, however, who had the frightened man close in custody, scorned to take a mean advantage of his situation by recommencing hostilities. He remained perfectly quiet, unless the delinquent attempted to stir. He then became as furious as ever, so that the prisoner prudently remained like a statue fixed against the wall, while Basto, like a sentinel on his post, kept a strict guard, lest he should escape before the family arrived. In about 20 minutes the master, in coming from the parlour to the counting-house, beheld the prisoner, and Basto walking backwards and forwards beside him. The dog, by 1,000 gesticulations, seemed to wish a proper explanation might take place. The master laughed heartily at the poor fellow's expense, as did he likewise when liberated, but he had ever after the prudence, when business brought him to the house, to ring loudly at the door, notwithstanding it frequently stood wide open. A carrier, on his way to Dumfries, had occasion to leave his cart and horse upon the public road, under the protection of a passenger and his dog Trusty. Upon his return, he missed a led horse belonging to a gentleman in the neighbourhood, which he had tied to the end of a cart, and likewise one of the female passengers. On inquiry, he was informed that during his absence the female, who had been anxious to try the mettle of the pony, had mounted it, and that the animal had set off at full speed. The carrier expressed much anxiety for the safety of the young woman, casting at the same time an expressive look at his dog. Trusty observed his master's eye, and aware of its meaning, instantly set off in pursuit of the pony, which he came up with soon after he had passed the first toll-bar on the Dalbeattie road, when he made a sudden spring, seized the bridle, and held the animal fast. Several people, having observed the circumstance and the perilous situation of the girl, came to her relief. The dog, however, notwithstanding their repeated endeavours, would not quit his hold of the bridle, and the pony was actually led into the stable with the dog till such time as the carrier should arrive. Upon the carrier entering the stable, Trusty wagged his tail in token of satisfaction, and immediately relinquished the bridle to his master. A short time ago a large cur belonging to a gentleman at Richmond in Yorkshire accidentally fell into a well, and for the moment he gave him up as lost. But as a sort of desperate effort to save the dog, he directed a boy to let down a rope he had into the well, in the hope that possibly it might catch around his leg or neck. No sooner, however, did the rope come within reach than the dog seized it with his teeth, and the parties above, finding it had secured him, began to draw up. When about halfway up he lost his hold and fell back. Again the rope was let down, and again the dog seized it, and he was drawn nearly to the mouth of the well when his bite gave way, and the third time he fell into the water. Once more the rope was let down, and this time the dog took so thorough a hold that he was brought triumphantly up, and set down in safety, shook the water from his hair, and wagged his tail, apparently as proud of the exploit as the other parties were gratified with it. End of The Cur Dog.
A Dog Day by Walter Emmanuel. Coffee Break Collection 29, Dogs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Grant Love. A Dog Day. 7 a.m. Woke up feeling rather below par, owing to disturbed rest. Hardly enough energy to stretch myself. In the middle of the night, a strange man came in by the kitchen window, very quietly, with a bag. I chummed up to him at once. He was nice to me, and I was nice to him. He got me down a piece of meat that I could not reach myself. While I was engaged on this, he took a whole lot of silver things and put them into the bag. Then, as he was leaving, the brute, I believe, now it was an accident, trod on my toe, making me yelp with pain. I bit him heartily, and he dropped his bag and scurried off through the window again. My yelping soon woke up the whole house, and in a very short time old Mr. Brown and young Mr. Brown appear. They at once spot the bag of silver. They then declare I have saved the house, and make no end of fuss with me. I am a hero. Later on, Miss Brown came down and fondled me lots, and kissed me, and tied a piece of pink ribbon round my neck, and made me look a fool. What's the good of ribbon? I should like to know. It's the most beastly tasting stuff there ever was. 8:30. Ate breakfast with difficulty. Have no appetite. 8:35. Ate kitten's breakfast. 8:36. An affair with the cat, the kitten's mother. But I soon leave her, as the coward does not fight fair, using claws. 9 o'clock. Washed by Mary. A hateful business. Put into a tub and rubbed all over, mouth, tail, and everywhere, with filthy, soapy water. That loathsome cat looking on all the while, and sneering in her dashed superior way. I don't know, I am sure, why the hussy should be so conceited. She has to clean herself. I keep a servant to clean me. At the same time, I often wish I was a black dog. They keep clean so much longer. Every finger mark shows up so frightfully on the white part of me. I am a sight after cook has been stroking me. 9:30. Showed myself in my washed state to the family. All very nice to me. Quite a triumphal entry, in fact. It is simply wonderful the amount of kudos I've got from that incident with the man. Miss Brown, whom I rather like, particularly enthusiastic, kissed me again and again, and called me a dear, clean, brave, sweet-smelling little doggy. 9:40. While a visitor was being let in at the front door, I rushed out and had the most glorious roll in the mud. Felt more like my old self then. 9:45. Visited the family again. Shrieks of horror on seeing me caked in mud, but all agreed that I was not to be scolded today, as I was a hero. Over the man. All, that is, except Aunt Brown, whose hand, for some reason or other, is always against me, though nothing is too good for the cat. She stigmatized me, quite gratuitously, as a horrid fellow. 9:50. Glorious thought. Rushed upstairs and rolled over and over on the old maid's bed. Thank heaven the mud was still wet. 10 to 10:15. Wagged tail. 10:16. Down into kitchen. While cook is watching regiment pass, I play with chops and bite big bits out of them. Cook, who is quite upset for the day by seeing so many soldiers, continues to cook the chops without noticing. 10:22... Dozed. 1:15. Ate kitten's dinner. 1:20. Attacked by beast of cat again. She scratched my hind leg, and at that I refused to go on. Memo. To take it out of her kittens later. 1:25. Upstairs into dining room. Family not finished lunch yet. Young Mr. Brown throws a bread pellet at me, hitting me on the nozzle. An insult. I swallow the insult. Then I go up to Miss Brown and look at her with my great pleading eyes. I guessed it. They are irresistible. She gives me a piece of pudding. Aunt Brown tells her she shouldn't, at which, with great pluck, Miss Brown tells her to mind her own business. I admire that girl more and more. 1:30. A windfall. A whole dish of mayonnaise fish on the slab in the hall. Before you can say Jack Robinson, I have bolted it. 1:32. Curious pains in my underneath. 1:33. Pains in my underneath get worse. 1:34. Horrid feeling of sickness. 1:35. Rush up into Aunt Brown's room and am sick there. 1:37. Better. Think I shall pull through if I am careful. 1:40. Almost well again. 1:41. Quite well again. Thank heavens. It was a narrow shave that time. People ought not to leave such stuff about. 1:42. Up into dining room, and, to show how well I am, I gallop round and round the room at full pelt about 20 times, steering myself by my tail. Then, as a grand finale, I jump twice onto the waistcoat part of old Mr. Brown, who is sleeping peacefully in the armchair. He wakes up very angry indeed, and uses words I have never heard before. Even Miss Brown, to my no little surprise, says it is very naughty of me. Old Mr. Brown insists on my being punished, and orders Miss Brown to beat me. Miss Brown runs the burglar for all he is worth, but no good. Old Mr. Brown is dead to all decent feelings. So Miss Brown beats me. Very nice. Thoroughly enjoyable. Just like being patted. But of course I yelp and pretend it hurts frightfully and do the sad eye business, and she soon leaves off and takes me into the next room and gives me 6 pieces of sugar. Good business. Must remember always to do this. Before leaving, she kisses me and explains that I should not have jumped on poor Pa, as he is the man who goes to the city to earn bones for me. Something in that, perhaps. Nice girl. 2 o'clock to 3:15, attempt to kill fur rug in back room. No good. 3:15 to 3:45, sulked. 3:46, small boy comes in and strokes me. I snap at him. I will not be everyone's plaything. 3:47 to 4 o'clock, another attempt to kill rug. Would have done it this time had not that hideous Aunt Brown come in and interfered. I did not say anything, but gave her such a look, as much as to say, I'll do for you one day. I think she understood. 4 o'clock to 5:15, slept. 5:15, awakened by bad attack of eczema. 5:20 to 5:30, slept again. 5:30, awakened again by eczema, caught one. 5:30 to 6 o'clock, frightened canary by staring greedily at it. 6 o'clock, visited kitchen folk, boned some bones. 6:15, stalked a kitten in kitchen passage. The other little cowards ran away. 6:20, things are looking brighter, helped mouse escape from cat. 6:30, upstairs, past the drawing room, door of old Mrs. Brown's bedroom open invitingly. I entered. Never been in before. Nothing much worth having. Ate a few flowers out of a bonnet. Beastly. Then into Miss Brown's room. Very tidy when I entered. Discovered there packet labelled High Class Pure Confectionery. Not bad. Pretty room. 7 o'clock. Down to supper. Ate it, but without much relish. I am off my feet today. 7:15. Ate kitten supper. But I do wish they would not give them that eternal fish. I am getting sick of it. 7:16, sick of it, in the garden. 7:25, nasty feeling of lassitude comes over me with loss of all initiative, so I decide to take things quietly and lie down by the kitchen fire. Sometimes I think that I am not the dog that I was. 8 o'clock, hooray! Appetite returning. 8:01, ravenous. 8:02, have one of the nicest pieces of coal I have ever come across. 8:05, nose around the kitchen floor and glean a bit of onion, an imitation tortoiseshell comb, a shrimp almost entire, an abominably stale chunk of bread, and about half a yard of capital string. After coal, I think I like string best. The family have noticed what a lot of this I stow away, and it was not a bad idea of young Mr. Brown's the other day, that if I had the end of a piece of string always hanging from my mouth, they could use me as a string box, though it is scarcely a matter for joking about. Still, it made me laugh. 8:30. If one had to rely on other people, one might starve. Fortunately, in the hall I happen on the treacle pudding, and I get first look in. Lap up the treacle and leave the suet for the family. A1. 8:40. Down into the kitchen again, sit by the fire, and pretend I don't know what treacle is like. But that vile cat is there, and I believe she guesses, keeps looking round at me with her hateful superior look. Dash her! What right has she got to give herself such airs? She's not half my size and pays no taxes. Dash her smugness. Dash her altogether. The sight of her maddens me, and when her back is turned I rush at her and bite her. The crafty coward wags her tail, pretending she likes it, so I do it again, and then she rounds on me and scratches my paw viciously, drawing blood and making me howl with pain. This brings Miss Brown down in a hurry. She kisses me, tells the cat she is a naughty cat, I'd have killed her for it, gives me some sugar, and wraps the paw up in a bread poultice. Lord, how that girl loves me. 9 o'clock, ate the bread poultice. 9:15, begin to get sleepy. 9:15 to 10 o'clock, dozed. 10 o'clock, led to kennel. 10:15, lights out. Thus ends another derned dull day. End of A Dog Day by Walter Emanuel. Recording by Grant Love.
The Dog and the Shadow by Aesop. Coffee Break Collection 29. Dogs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dog and the Shadow. It happened that a dog had got a piece of meat and was carrying it home in his mouth to eat it in peace. Now on his way home he had to cross a plank lying across a running brook. As he crossed, he looked down and saw his own shadow reflected in the water beneath. Thinking it was another dog with another piece of meat, he made up his mind to have that also. So he made a snap at the shadow in the water, and as he opened his mouth, the piece of meat fell out, dropped into the water, and was never seen more. Beware lest you lose the substance by grasping at the shadow. End of The Dog and the Shadow.
A Dog Story by Anonymous, printed in Cassell's Family Magazine, 1884. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in September 2020. A Dog Story. Mr. Severn's marvelous story in the July number, all the more marvelous as he vouches for the truth of the story, reminds me of a very touching instance of the love of animals in the lower grade of creation for man, a love strong as death, testified by as tragical an ending as that of the poor boa constrictor Cleopatra. Mine, too, is a true story, and as I am long and well known to the editor of Cassell's magazine, my name, which I give him, will be a voucher for my veracity. When I was a boy, more than half a century ago, living with my parents in a remote part of the country, we had a very remarkable carriage dog, the first of his kind imported into that part of the world, though the breed is now common enough. One of those dogs speckled all over with black spots on a white ground, and then called Dalmatian boarhounds. Nelson was large, strong, muscular, and deep-chested, surly and unsocial in his habits, verging on the misanthropical, an unusual quality in dogs, save to the favored few whom he honored with his friendship. To these he was as true as steel, faithful and fond, though not demonstratively so, like those fawning dogs that are perpetually jumping upon you, soiling your clothes, and slavering on your hands. He was decidedly a canine character, an oddity of a dog, grave and taciturn, rarely giving vocal expression to his feelings, save when irritated, and then his growl, his bark, and above all his bite, were to be dreaded, as many a frightened boy and tattered garment testified, for he hated beggars like a parish beadle, and treated ragged peasants with aristocratic hauteur. Many a time have I seen the workmen, as they passed him at a respectful distance, take off their hats to him, for the coachman, who was a wag in his way, told the simple peasants that by so doing they would be sure to avert his animosity. He disliked his own race as cordially as he did that of men, and rarely approached other dogs, except in a combative spirit, and few of his species came off victorious in an encounter. To complete his physique, I have only to add that he had one wall eye, white and glaring, which gave a special ferocity to his countenance, so that one might say of him, as Launce said of his dog Crab, "I think he is the sourest-natured dog that lives." He was a dog, too, of marvelous adroitness. I taught him to walk up a ladder placed at a rather steep inclination into a hayloft over the coach-house, and down again, which was a more difficult feat. It was an amusing sight to see the gaping rustics watching this performance, especially as he descended with an increasing velocity till he reached the third lowest rung, from which he sprang to the ground. And he had other accomplishments. He would ride one of the carriage horses when taken out to exercise, sitting on his back like a monkey on a bear, the coachman riding the other. How well I remember it, as if it were but yesterday. Those two noble bay horses, Peer and Andrew, walking slowly along the road with their dissimilar riders. The horses took kindly to their dog-groom, for they loved him and he loved them, so that this equino-canine affection was ludicrously touching. They spent their lives together, they and the coachman. They were rarely separated, for he went with the coachman when he walked or rode, and ran after the carriage when he drove. And now comes the tragic part of my story. It happened one summer that my father and mother went to the metropolis, a rare event with them, and took the carriage and the horses. The dog my father would not take, so he was locked into the stable when they left, and I and my brother alone of the family remained behind. When Nelson was liberated, some hour or so after the party had gone, he was in a state of great distress and perplexity. He rushed about in every direction, seeking his companions in vain. He did not howl or whine, but bore his grief in silence. At last he went into the coachman's bedroom, and, poking out a pair of his old shoes from under his bed, lay down beside them, expecting no doubt that the man would return and look for his shoes. From this spot he rarely moved. With each day his misery increased. After a time he refused all food, and moped about, sad and stupid, so that it was most affecting to look at him. No one ventured to soothe or caress him, for we began to fear that he might be falling into a state of melancholy madness, and that it would not be safe to meddle with him. All we could do was to leave food and water near him. And so he went on day by day, moping and pining, growing weaker and weaker, till he scarcely stirred from the room. It was nearly a week later, as well as I remember, when my father and mother returned late in the evening. The sound of the carriage wheels and the tramp of the horses as they entered the stable-yard was audible enough and reached the ears of poor Nelson. He rose, staggered into the yard, and over to the coachman, who had come down from the coach-box. Then, licking his hand as the man stooped down to caress him, he uttered a faint cry and fell down at his feet. He was dead. Need I say how we all mourned over poor Nelson, how we forgot his strange and surly ways in this touching exhibition of love and fidelity? We buried him as reverently as Byron buried his dog, though we wrote no misanthropic epitaph over his grave. But I have moralized over his life and death. Assuredly, the dog is one of the greatest blessings in animal life that God has given to man. It is, I believe, the only creature that prefers man to its own species, loving him with a love that is utterly unselfish, a love that neglect will not weaken, that chastisement will not destroy. Yet, strange to say, many nations have held the dog in contempt, if not in detestation. With the Jews and other Asiatic nations, the name of dog was a term of reproach. "Is thy servant a dog?" said Hazael to Elijah. And the most offensive expression that could be used was to compare a man to a dead dog. This no doubt arose partly from the fact that dogs were considered unclean, and partly from their habits when left wild and undomesticated. But we have learned better things, and have found that the domesticated dog is the noblest of creatures, the most loyal of servants, the most inalienable of friends. Were I to choose a crest to my arms, I would take the dog, as Sterne did the starling, and say with him, let the herald's officers twist his neck if they dare. And this article is signed W.
The Dyer's Dog by E. Nesbit, Coffee Break Collection 29, Dogs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Jones, Bonita Springs, Florida. The Dyer's Dog. She was beautiful, with a strange, unearthly beauty. She had a little black nose, her eyes were small, but bright and full of charm. Her ears were long and soft, and her tail curled like one of the ostrich plumes in the window of the dyer with whom she lived. I have met many little dogs with noses as charming, and eyes as bright, and tails as curly, but never one who, like my Bessie, was rich, deep pink all over. I lived with a baker then. I was sitting on his doorstep when she first delighted my eyes. I ran across the road to give her good morning. She seemed pleased to see me. We had a little chat about the weather and other dogs in the street, about buns and rats and the vices of the domestic cat. Her manners and her conversation were as bright and charming as her eyes. Before we parted, we had made an appointment for the next afternoon, and as I said good-bye, I ventured to ask, "How is it, lady, that you are of such a surpassingly beautiful color?" "It is natural in our family," she said, tossing her pretty ears. "My mother was the royal crimson dog at the court of the King of India." I bowed with deep respect and withdrew, for I heard them calling me at home. The next day I looked for my beautiful pink-colored lady, but I looked in vain. Instead, a dog of a bright sky blue, with a yellow ribbon round its neck, sat in the sun on the dyer's doorstep. Yet could I be mistaken? That nose, those ears, that feathery tail, those bright and beaming eyes? I went across. She received me with some embarrassment, which disappeared as I talked gaily of milk and guinea pigs and the habits of the cat's meat man. Before we parted, I said, "You have changed your dress." "Yes," she said, "it's so common and vulgar to wear always one color." "But I thought," I hesitated, "that your mother was the royal crimson dog at the court of—" "Well, so she was," replied the lady promptly, "but my father was the well-known sky-blue terrier at the Crystal Palace Dog Show. I resemble both my parents." I retired, fascinated by her high breeding and graceful explanations. Through my dreams that night wandered a long procession of blue and crimson dogs. The next day, when I hurried to keep the appointment she had been good enough to make with me, I found her a deep purple. Again I concealed my surprise, while we talked of subjects of common interest of dog, collars and chains and kennels of biscuits, bones, and the outrage of the muzzling order. And at last I said, "You have changed your dress again. Your mother was the royal—" "Oh, don't," she said. "It's so tiresome to keep repeating things. My father was red and my mother was blue, and I myself, as you see, am purple. Don't you know that crimson and blue make purple? Any child with a shilling box of paints could have told you that." I thanked her and came away. Purple seemed to me the most beautiful color in the world. But the next day she was green as grass. After the customary exchange of civilities, I remarked firmly, "Blue and crimson may make purple, but green is my favorite color," she said briskly. "I suppose a dog is not to be bound down by the prejudices of his parents." I went away very sadly, and as I went I noticed that there were some curtains in the dyer's window of exactly the same tint as my friend's dress. The next day She was gone. I sought her in vain. The day after, a French poodle appeared on the Dyer's doorstep, dressed in stripes of orange and scarlet. I went boldly across to him. "Good morning, old man. How do you come to be that color?" I said. "They dye me so," he said gloomily. "It's a dreadful lot for a dog that respects himself." I never saw Bessie but once again. She seemed then to be living with a tinsmith, and her color was a gingery white. I hope I am too much of a gentleman to taunt any lady in misfortune, but I couldn't help saying, "Why don't you wear any of your beautiful colored dresses now?" She answered me curtly, for she saw that she had ceased to charm. "I gave up wearing my pretty dresses," she said, "because silly people ask me so many questions about them." As usual, I accepted her explanations in silence, but when I see the poodle opposite in his varying glories of blue and green and orange and purple, I can't help thinking that perhaps my fair Bessie did not always speak the truth. End of The Dyer's Dog.
An Elegy on the Death of a Mad Dog by Oliver Goldsmith. Coffee Break Collection 29, Dogs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. An Elegy on the Death of a Mad Dog. Good people all of every sort, give ear unto my song, and if you find it wondrous short, it cannot hold you long. In Islington there lived a man, of whom the world might say, that still a godly race he ran, where'er he went to pray. A kind and gentle heart he had, to comfort friends and foes, the naked every day he clad, when he put on his clothes. And in that town a dog was found, as many dogs there be, both mongrel, puppy, whelp, and hound, and curs of low degree. This dog and man at first were friends, but when a pick began, the dog, to gain some private ends, went mad and bit the man. Around from all the neighboring streets the wondering neighbors ran, and swore the dog had lost his wits to bite so good a man. The wound it seemed both sore and sad to every Christian eye, and while they swore the dog was mad, they swore the man would die. But soon a wonder came to light, that showed the rogues they lied. The man recovered of the bite, the dog it was that died. End of An Elegy on the Death of a Mad Dog.
From the Jaws of a Wolf by an unknown author. Coffee Break Collection 29, Dogs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Jones, Bonita Springs, Florida. From the Jaws of a Wolf, a tale of a dog's bravery. "You have a noble-looking dog there, Mr. Knowles," I remarked to the master of a Wisconsin farmhouse, where I had stopped for the night, as I noticed an enormous mastiff that was stretched at full length along the floor. My hostess's 2-year-old baby was playing with the animal's ears, while the other children were jumping and tumbling about over the body. "Yes," answered Mr. Knowles, "and he is as noble as he looks. He has justified his claim to all the kindnesses we can bestow on him. Part of his history is sad enough, poor fellow. I suppose you have had him for some time?" "No," he replied, "only since last winter. The story of his life before then is a complete blank so far as we are concerned." "What?" I asked in astonishment. "Do you mean to say that such a splendid animal as this is a stray dog? What a pity it is that you can't talk and tell us where you are from, old fellow," I continued, patting the huge head. Thereupon Lion solemnly hit the floor 1 or 2 sounding thumps with his tail, and then stood up and pushed his nose into my lap. "He is quick to recognize his friends," said Mr. Knowles, "and has already included you among them. He is very affectionate, and will allow our youngsters to do what they like with him. But let him who rouses Lion's anger beware, for he is then a lion indeed." "I conclude from what you say, then, that you have seen him thus tested?" I asked. "Yes," replied Mr. Knowles with emphasis, "I have indeed, and it was at a moment when my own life depended upon his strength and courage." "Please tell me how it happened," I begged. "I'm sure the story must be most interesting." "All right," said Mr. Knowles as he settled himself for the narrative while I listened eagerly for what was to come. "Until last winter," said he, "I, like most others hereabouts, cared very little for our western wolves. I had never seen any large ones, and I was convinced that a big Newfoundland dog, such as I then possessed, was a match for the fiercest of them. One cold winter morning I had to go to the village of L , 3 miles away from here. I was obliged to walk, as heavy snowdrifts in the way prevented me from riding. I was not alone, however, for my dog accompanied me. He was, as I told you, a Newfoundland, a big fellow and full of pluck. We had done about 2/3 of this distance when I noticed a movement in some bushes nearby, and in a moment the head and shoulders of a great wolf appeared among them. I saw at once that he was far above the average size, but I did not mind him, since, besides my dog, I had my double-barreled gun with me. I'm a bad shot, it's true, but having the gun reassured me. Poor Tige, my dog, made straight for the wolf, and they clinched at the edge of the thicket. Such a fight as that I hope I never may see again. I knew that Tige would never give in while he lived, but as the furious animals rolled over and over each other, I soon perceived that he was getting the worst of it. You can imagine my feelings at that moment. I ran toward them at once with my gun leveled, but they kept on changing their position so quickly that I was afraid to fire for fear of injuring Tige. At last I fired, but my shot seemed to have missed. In any case, however, I should have been too late to save my dog's life. In an instant the wolf left his dying victim and rushed upon me. I discharged my other barrel, but it had no effect. As he approached, I could see his eyes gleaming like coals of fire, and the open mouth disclosing the grim rows of teeth. He was very long and gaunt, while his bristling hairs and the blood with which he was covered added to the ferociousness of his appearance. At such a moment one's brain acts quickly. Short as was the time occupied by the wolf's advance, I recognized at once the hopelessness of my position and the horror of my impending fate. Then my thoughts flew back to home, and I wondered how my wife and children would get on without me. But I was determined to die fighting, at any rate. Just as my foe was upon me, I sprang aside, and grasping my gun by the barrels, struck at him with all the strength of despair. Where I hit him, I do not know, but the force of the blow was sufficient to break my weapon short off at the breech. The effect of the blow gave me a little breathing time, and when the wolf renewed his attack, I was able to meet him once more with the part of the gun still left in my hand. Again and again I showered down my blows upon him, until at last the strong steel barrels actually began to bend. But all my efforts were in vain, and at last, utterly exhausted, I realized that the end could no longer be delayed. Just then, something dark flashed past me, and to my surprise and thankfulness, I perceived that help had arrived. The biggest dog I had ever seen had fastened upon the wolf, and not all the latter's efforts were able to shake him off. Much as I should have liked to assist my rescuer, in my present condition this was impossible, and I was forced to stand by and await the issue of the terrible combat. Often it seemed as though the wolf would once more prove victorious, but then the great dog would put forth all his strength in a mighty effort that turned the tide in his favor. At length, to my relief, the wolf began to weaken and finally turned to run away. But this the dog would not permit, and the fight began again. Now, however, the dog's success was no longer doubtful, and but a short time sufficed for him to make an end of his grim opponent. Then, and not till then, he turned to me, and grasping my coat, attempted to pull me away. Following in the direction in which he was urging me, after going about half a mile, I came upon the senseless body of a man. The stranger's limbs were badly frozen, and all my efforts to revive him were unavailing. While I was engaged in this task, a neighbor came up and at once hurried off to the village for assistance. In about an hour, everything that medical skill could suggest was being done for the poor man, but he remained unconscious, and that night he died. We found out afterwards that he was an English man without relatives and with no friend but his faithful dog. A sudden attack of illness must have overtaken him and left him in the state in which I found him. I discovered by experiment that the dog answered to the name of Lion, and tried hard to induce him to come with me. For a long time he refused, appearing utterly inconsolable at his master's death. Indeed, he would not leave the body while it remained in sight. But after the funeral, he at last accepted the inevitable and allowed me to take him home. From that day he has been one of the family, and as I see him playing and romping with the children, I often think how little they realize the great debt that they and I owe him. End of From the Jaws of a Wolf. Fuzzles, the Story of a Puppy, by G.B. Bergen. Coffee Break Collection 29, Dogs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Jones, Bonita Springs, Florida. Fuzzles, the Story of a Puppy. "What you want?" said the family friend, as he looked around our pretty little rooms with that supremely aggravating air of toleration which the family friend always considers he is privileged to assume. "What you want is a dog, just to take off the loneliness, as it were, of being all by yourself." My wife interrupted the family friend. "Why, we have been married only a month, uncle, and," indignantly, "we are not lonely." "Ah, yes, my dear," replied our avuncular relative, "that's all very well. I've been married myself, twice, and I know what it is like. There's nothing so useful to a young, newly married couple as a dog which tones with the furniture and helps to provide a common topic of conversation. It will also keep your husband from going to the club, and he's given up his club." "Don't interrupt, my dear. He'll go back to it." They always began by giving up everything and gradually going back again. It is a way young newly married men have had from time immemorial. I was young myself once and did the same thing. You must get a dog for him. If he hears the watchdog's honest bark baying a deep-mouthed welcome to the intrusive grocer's boy or milkman, and all that kind of thing. It will lend an added zest to domesticity, so to speak. You take my advice." He frowned portentously, as much as to say, "If you fail to do so, then nevermore be legatees of mine, and buy a dog. If I don't see that dog here the next time I come to stay with you, I candidly, I shall cut you off without a shilling," we expected him to add, but he hesitated and didn't. "Be extremely disappointed, extremely." Then he went away and left us gazing somewhat blankly at one another. "I suppose we must get a dog, dear," said my wife. "You know what your uncle is when roused. If he wanted us to keep a tame megatherium or an ornithorhynchus on the back lawn, we should have to do it." "But, my dear girl, how am I to exercise this little beast? I come home tired, and I want to write stories. The time not occupied in writing stories I devote to you, and then there'll be this little brute yapping aloud for exercise. Just fancy how pleasant it will be when I'm comfortably settled down in my armchair, if you remind me that I must rise and go for miles through suburban Hornsey, leading the dog with a string, or allowing him to lead me. I shall be taken for a blind man, and have people offer me coppers. Uncle Peter's a pompous, purple old—" A pretty hand was laid upon my lips. "Your Uncle Peter has been very kind to us, dear, and I should rather like having a little dog here when you are away all day." Of course, that ended the discussion. The matter presented itself to me in a new light. To please my wife, I would have bought a Newfoundland or a St. Bernard already fitted up with life-saving appliances and ready for action. There must be some poor wretched dog at the Battersea home who would be glad to make my acquaintance, or at least would tolerate me for a few hours every evening. I decided to go to Battersea the next day and buy something canine. 10 shillings, I believe, is the usual price charged there, utterly irrespective of weight, moral character, or antecedents. I bought 2 dogs in rapid succession, but the cold weather was against them, and they developed every possible complaint except hydrophobia. They had to be sent back to Battersea, and the officials there seemed to think that those dogs would soon get over their troubles and end life's pilgrimage in a comfortably painless manner. Just as I was preparing to start for Battersea the 3rd time, I lived there on and off for about a week, and began to be looked upon as a sporting character by all the guards on the metropolitan extension. In came my friend P. Blank, the editor of a well-known illustrated paper. P. Blank carried an animated bundle of something under his arm. It looked like a small doormat, but one end of it waggled, and from the other end shone out 2 intensely black eyes filled with dancing light. P. Blank proudly deposited his bundle on the carpet. It sat up on the waggling end. 2 silky ears erected themselves in a perkily inquisitive manner, and I saw that my visitor was a puppy of about 4 months old. "Affection's offering," P. Blank said proudly. "We couldn't come to the wedding as we were away at the time, so cast about for one of our most precious possessions to give you. I've brought it along." He pointed to the puppy, which suddenly became very grave, as if it realized that the matter was now assuming a more personal complexion. "What's that?" I asked. "'Tisn't a dog? You have really the audacity to call that a dog? It's more like Berlin wool work than anything else." "Did you think it was a giraffe?" P. Blank answered, somewhat testily. "It is a very valuable pedigree, prick-eared, Skye Terrier pup with many good points." I picked up the soft, silky bundle. "Why, he hasn't a point about him. He's as soft and round as a ball of silk." "We call him George Augustus Sala," said P. Blank, "because he always wears a white waistcoat," and he pointed to the puppy's white breast. I never knew any other pup of the breed to have a white waistcoat. It is unique, never been done before. This pup is something exceptional. We think he has a future before him. Will it want washing? The waistcoat, I mean. Occasionally. Now, would you mind playing with him? It diverts his attention. P. handed me an India rubber ball. Just throw it carelessly about, as if you were doing it merely to oblige him, until I can get out of the office without his knowing it. My wife is crying at home. Crying? What for? Because she can't bear to part with him. He has been a great deal to us, but we have his mother and cannot keep more than one dog. They gnaw at furniture, and then we have to get fresh things, which becomes expensive. If you throw the ball into that corner and smile, I will bolt while he waddles after it. I took the ball, and P. hurriedly effaced himself. George Augustus attracted a good deal of attention that evening in the train. Before I reached Hornsey, he was on friendly terms with all the people in the carriage, particularly one old lady whose bonnet strings he affectionately chewed for the greater part of the journey. She kissed him at parting and gave me her card. If the dear little fellow should ever want a home, she said, write to me, and I will come for him, even if it should be in the middle of the night. I promised I would do so, smuggled George Augustus under my coat, and when I reached home, hurriedly placed him on my wife's lap, where he lay looking up into her face with his wonderful eyes soft and sweet, yet full of quaint owlish solemnity. I am here, they seemed to say. Now what have you to say about it? I must confess to feeling rather a jealous pang as my wife hugged that puppy, and he cordially responded by licking her nose. After her rapture had subsided a little, what are we going to call him? She asked. Well, his name is George Augustus Sala. Then it must be changed, returned my wife with prompt decision. A little wee baby thing like this shall not be called such a long name. Shall it be Fuzzy Wuzzy? You hit upon it at once. Don't you remember Kipling's Here's to you, Fuzzy Wuzzy, with your hayrick head of hair? He does look more like a miniature hayrick than anything else. Fuzzy Wuzzy, however, soon degenerated into Fuzzles. Unsympathizing friends who noticed his appetite said that it ought to be Guzzles. But this we resented, and it soon came to be an understood thing that no remarks of disparaging nature were to be made about our puppy. For 3 months he was a constant joy to us. It was absurd to call Fuzzles a mere animal, for he had all the intelligence of a self-willed child, varied with lovable fits, during the continuance of which we felt that so saintly a dog could not live long. At breakfast and dinner he sat on a chair by my wife's side, and was allowed to have bits of bread at the conclusion of the repast. For some time he would control his impatience and sit silent, but as we neared the end of the meal he began to give short, sharp barks, and then look around with an unconscious air, as if they had proceeded from some other animal altogether. Soon he developed a rooted antipathy to cats, and was never happier than within a foot of an old Tom's tail as it disappeared through our garden palings. But at length there came a day when even cats could not rouse Fuzzles. He lay about listlessly, with no appetite, and indisposed to move. Don't you think I ought to give him some beef tea? Asked my wife. And we gave him beef tea accordingly, although it bored him very much. This went on for a fortnight. Fuzzles crawled about as if he could scarcely drag one paw after the other. Suddenly he recovered his former spirits and became more winning than ever. A fortnight later he began to shiver, declined to touch food, and get as thin as the proverbial herring. At last my wife carried him off to a veterinary college and asked what was the matter with Fuzzles. We can't take him in here, said the doctor, as you don't subscribe to the institution. However, if you will call on my friend Dr. H., he will look after your puppy. It's a very bad case of pneumonia and distemper. My wife took a cab and drove to Dr. H.'s. Dr. H. was not at home, but she left Fuzzles in charge of a domestic and sorrowfully came home. The next morning we received a telegram. Please fetch puppy, or will fret himself to death. Will attend him at your house. We immediately posted off to fetch Fuzzles, who greeted us with momentary rapture, and then nestled into my wife's arms and shut his suffering eyes. We took him home and made him a flannel jacket, through which his stumpy little legs were always working in unexpected places. He had beef tea every 2 hours, a powerful tonic every 4. His head was also held over a jug of boiling water 4 times a day. After the second experiment with the boiling water, Fuzzles gave up struggling against it. Very well, he seemed to say as I lifted him up on the kitchen table. If you like to parboil me alive, you can do so. It doesn't make much difference. Give me some more minced steak afterward. That's the only thing I really like, but I wish you'd let me alone. I've such a lot of things to think over, this jacket among others, and that fiend in the spectacles who's always jabbing spoons down my throat. Well, this went on for 10 days. At last it became evident to me that Fuzzles was beloved of the gods, who meant to call him hence. On the evening before his death, directly I knocked on the door, there was a shambling sound in the passage, and Fuzzles, a wraith in white flannel, crawled slowly along the hall toward the front door, but lay down halfway with a feeble wag of his tail. I picked him up and carried the poor little wasted thing back to the kitchen, where Eliza the maid wept over him without concealment. "He's been in to say good-bye to Mrs., sir," she said. "Twice this afternoon he's crawled into the drawing-room and laid his head against her dress, just looking solemn-like and not saying nothing. He's a-going fast, sir. You mark my words. He's a-going fast." The next morning, Fuzzles had a fit, and the doctor sent for a chemist with instructions to bring and administer poison. Fuzzles took the poison languidly, rolled over on his side with slowly glazing baby eyes, gave one sigh, and was no more. When I returned in the evening, I found Eliza sitting in the kitchen, her apron over her head, and Fuzzles' customary corner vacant. My wife was on the verge of tears. Someone knocked at the front door, and we both started nervously. "It's the boy come to take Fuzzles away," said my wife, clutching my arm. We heard the boy's heavy, lumbering steps go slowly down the passage, and presently he came blundering back. Then he knocked the box against the wall and half dropped poor Fuzzles, but recovered himself with an effort. "It sounds like a coffin being taken away," said my wife. The boy's footsteps receded across the hall. He noisily slammed to the door. We heard the front gate open. His footsteps grew fainter and fainter, and Eliza came in with her best black bonnet on. "What's the matter, Eliza?" I asked. Eliza checked a fresh outburst with difficulty. "It ain't right not to see him buried, sir. Won't you and the missus come too?" We all crept after the boy at a respectful distance until he entered the field which he had selected for Fuzzles' last resting place. From behind an ancient oak we watched the interment with mingled emotions. At length the boy patted down the sod with his spade, and went away blithely whistling. Then Eliza, my wife, and I crept homeward through the shadows, feeling almost as if we had lost a child. End of Fuzzles, the story of a puppy.
The Little Dog Match by Anonymous. Coffee Break Collection 29, Dogs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. The Little Dog Match. 50 years ago, my great-grandmother sat in the porch of her cottage, looking with pleasure on the fragrant flowers growing in her garden and listening to the song of her canaries hanging over her head. It was a sultry August evening, and gradually the sky overcast. A solemn stillness stole over the scene, while large drops of rain and heavy claps of thunder denoted the approach of a storm. She rose and removed her birds to the interior of the cottage. On returning to the open door, she saw a woman dragging wearily up the garden path, followed by a lean and hungry-looking dog. "For the love of mercy, ma'am," began the tramp, "please to buy a box or two of matches of a poor woman, for I've not tasted food this blessed day." My great-grandmother looked at her with pity. Benevolence formed a large ingredient in her character. Here stood a fellow creature whose forlorn appearance and sickly countenance denoted her condition as plainly as her words, while the famished animal beside her was evidently unable to travel further. The good old lady spoke at once in her primitive hospitality. "Come in, poor soul, and sit you down and rest. A storm is coming up. Here, take this meal and enjoy it. You are truly welcome." She busied herself in setting food before the wanderer, and then turned to the wanderer's companion, her dog. "The poor dumb beast is nearly dead," she said, and amid the violence of the storm, she exercised the bidding of the apostle to the best of her ability. As soon as the tempest subsided, the woman rose to go, full of gratitude for the kindness shown her. The dog reposed comfortably on a rug and seemed indisposed to quit his new home. "Would you care to have the dog, mistress?" said the owner. "He's none so handsome, but he'd guard thy house, and it's part we must, sooner or later. He'll have a blessed exchange, that's certain." My great-grandmother thanked her, and expressed her pleasure at the prospect of keeping the dog. The woman went her way. Her canine companion stayed in his new home, and was, in remembrance of his former owner, named Match. He proved faithful and affectionate to his mistress, and soon learned to distinguish her particular friends, while to members of her family he ever paid the greatest attention, trotting regularly every day to see her daughter, my grandmother, who lived in the next village, about a mile apart. He would, if the front door was open, walk through the house to the part where the family lived, receive and return their greetings, walk to a particular mat which lay at the foot of the staircase, lie down for a time, and then return. After he had lived some years with my aged relative, a nephew of hers from the border of Sherwood Forest came to pay her a visit, and witnessing the intelligence and fidelity of Match, begged him as a present. Very loath she was to part from her faithful friend, but the entreaties of her favorite nephew prevailed, and when he returned home he took the dog with him. His journey was performed partly by stage wagons, partly on foot. Finally he wrote to announce his safe arrival at home with Match. 3 weeks later, as my grandmother and her daughters sat at work one afternoon with open doors and windows, the apparition of an emaciated dog stumbled over the threshold, crawled feebly through the room to his accustomed corner, and sank exhausted upon the mat, too far gone to do more than raise his eyes for sympathy to his well-known friends. There was a great outcry. "It is poor Match!" Work was thrown aside, and all gathered round the dog. His bleeding feet were bathed, and some milk given him, which he drank eagerly, afterwards licking the hands outstretched to help. Then, with a sigh of relief and contentment, he fell asleep, and stirred not all night. But in the early morning, with a joyous bark, he bounded off through the doorway, and swiftly made his way to his dear old home, where he was received with every demonstration of delight, which he returned with interest. From that time till the day of his death some years later, Match was regarded as a hero, having traveled more than 100 miles on foot, a road over which he had passed only once. Afterwards, it transpired that he had experienced a beating for attempting to escape previously, and when his flight was discovered, it was at once conjectured whither he had gone, though it was considered impossible for him to accomplish the journey. Like many humble heroes, Match never played a prominent part out of his own circle, but among the family in which he lived, his name is handed down as an instance of true fidelity. He had no pretensions to beauty, being a sandy-colored dog with short, rough hair, but must have possessed great powers of endurance and a wonderful memory. End of The Little Dog Match. Recording by Colleen McMahon.
A Noble Dog by E. Nesbit. Coffee Break Collection 29. Dogs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Noble Dog. Rover would go into the water fast enough for a bathe or a swim, but he would not bring anything out. The children used to throw in sticks, and Rover and I used to bound in together, but I would bring the stick back while he swam round and round enjoying himself. I am not vain, but I could not help feeling how much superior I was to such a dog as Rover. He is a prized Newfoundland, and I am only a humble retriever of an obscure family. So one day I said to him, "Why don't you fetch the sticks out when the children throw them in?" "I don't care about sticks," he said. "But it's so grand and clever to be able to fetch them out." "Is it?" he answered. "I know it is, for the children tell me so." "Do they?" he said. "I wonder you are not ashamed," I went on, a little nettled by his meekness, "never to do anything useful. I should be, if I were you." "Ah," he said, "but you see you are not. Good night." We used to spend a great deal of time by the river. The children loved to play there, and we dogs were always expected to go with them. One day, as I was lying asleep on the warm grass by the river bank, I heard a splash. I jumped in, but there was no stick, only one of the children floating down on the river and screaming whenever her head came from under the water. I thought it was a new kind of game, not very interesting, so I swam out again. And just as I was shaking the water out of my ears, I heard another great flop, and there was Rover in the water, holding on to the child's dress. He pulled her out some 10 yards down the stream, and oh, if you could have seen the fuss that the master and mistress and the rest of the children made of that black and white spotted person. "Why, Rover," I said afterwards when we had got home and were talking it over, "whatever made you think that the child wanted to be pulled out of the water?" "It's my business to pull people out of the water," he said. "But," I urged, "I always thought you were too stupid to understand things." "Did you?" he said, turning his mild eyes on me. "Why didn't you explain to me that you—" "My dear dog," he said, "I never think it worthwhile to fetch sticks out of the water, and I never think it worthwhile to explain things to stupid people." End of A Noble Dog. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
On a Dog and a Man Also by Hilaire Belloc. Coffee Break Collection 29, Dogs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Schempf. On a Dog and a Man Also. There lives in the middle of the Weald, upon the northern edge of a small wood, where a steep brow of orchard pasture goes down to a little river, a recluse who is of middle age and possessed of all the ordinary accomplishments. That is, French and English literature are familiar to him. He can himself compose. He has read his classical Latin and can easily decipher such Greek as he has been taught in youth. He is unmarried. He is by birth a gentleman. He enjoys an income sufficient to give him food and wine, and has for a companion a dog, who by the standard of dogs is somewhat more elderly than himself. This dog is called Argus, not that he has 100 eyes, or even 2. Indeed, he has but 1, for the other, or right eye, he lost the sight of long ago from luxury and lack of exercise. This dog Argus is neither small nor large. He is brown in color and covered, though now but partially, with curly hair. In this he resembles many other dogs, but he differs from most of his breed in a further character, which is that by long association with a recluse he has acquired a human manner that is unholy. He is fond of affected poses. When he sleeps, it is with that abandonment of fatigue only naturally to be found in mankind. He watches sunsets and listens mournfully to music. Cooked food is dearer to him than raw, and he will eat nuts, a monstrous thing in a dog, and proof of corruption. Nevertheless, or rather, on account of all this, the dog Argus is exceedingly dear to his master, and of both I had the other day a singular revelation when I set out at evening to call upon my friend. The sun had set, but the air was still clear, and it was light enough to have shot a bat, had there been bats about, and had one a gun, when I knocked at the cottage door and opened it. Right within, one comes to the first of the 3 rooms which the recluse possesses, and there I found him tenderly nursing the dog Argus, who lay groaning in the armchair, and putting on all the airs of a Christian man at the point of death. The recluse did not even greet me, but asked me only in a hurried way how I thought the dog Argus looked. I answered gravely, and in a low tone, so as not to disturb the sufferer, that as I had not seen him since Tuesday, when he was, for an elderly dog, in the best of health, he certainly presented a sad contrast, but that perhaps he was better than he had been some few hours before, and that the recluse himself would be the best judge of that. My friend was greatly relieved at what I said, and told me that he thought the dog was better, compared at least with that same morning. Then, whether you believe it or not, he took him by the left leg just above the paw and held it for a little time, as though he were feeling a pulse, and said, he came back less than 24 hours ago. It seemed that the dog Argus, for the first time in 14 years, had run away, and that for the first time in perhaps 20 or 30 years the emotion of loss had entered into the life of the recluse, and that he had felt something outside books, and outside the contemplation of the landscape about his hermitage. In a short time the dog fell into a slumber, as was shown by a number of grunts and yaps which proved his sleep, for the dog Argus is of that kind which hunts in dreams. His master covered him reverently rather than gently with an Indian cloth, and still leaving him in the armchair, sat down upon a common wooden chair close by, and gazed pitifully at the fire. For my part, I stood up, and wondered at them both, and wondered also at that in man by which he must attach himself to something, even if it be but a dog, a politician, or an ungrateful child. When he had gazed at the fire a little while, the recluse began to talk, and I listened to him talking. Even if they had not dug up so much earth to prove it, I should have known, said he, that the Odyssey was written not at the beginning of a civilization, nor in the splendor of it, but toward its close. I do not say this from the evening light that shines across its pages, for that is common to all profound work, but I say it because of the animals, and especially because of the dog, who was the only one to know his master when the master came home a beggar to his own land, before his youth was restored to him, and before he got back his women and his kingship by the bending of his bow, and before he hanged the housemaids and killed all those who had despised him. But how, said I, for I am younger than he, can the animals in the poem show you that the poem belongs to a decline? Why, said he, because at the end of a great civilization the air gets empty, the light goes out of the sky, the gods depart, and the men in their loneliness put out a groping hand, catching at the friendship of, and trying to understand, whatever lives and suffers as they do. You will find it never fail that where a passionate regard for the animals about us, or even a great tenderness for them, is to be found, there is also to be found decay in the state. I hope not, said I. Moreover, it cannot be true, for in the 13th century, which was certainly the healthiest time we ever had, animals were understood, and I will prove it to you in several carvings. He shrugged his shoulders and shook his head, saying, in the rough and in general it is true, and the reason is the reason I have given you, that when decay begins, whether of a man or of a state, there comes with it an appalling and torturing loneliness, in which our energies decline into a strong affection for whatever is constantly our companion, and for whatever is certainly present upon earth, for we have lost the sky. Then if the senses are so powerful in a decline of the state, there should come at the same time, said I, a quick forgetfulness of the human dead, and an easy change of human friendship. There does, he answered, and to that there was no more to be said. I know it by my own experience, he continued. When yesterday at sunset I looked for my dog Argus and could not find him. I went out into the wood and called him. The darkness came, and I found no trace of him. I did not hear him barking far off, as I have heard him before, when he was younger, and went hunting for a while. And 3 times that night I came back out of the wild into the warmth of my house, making sure he would have returned, but he was never there. The 3rd time I had gone a mile out to the gamekeeper's to give him money if Argus should be found, and I asked him as many questions and as foolish as a woman would ask. Then I sat upright into the night, thinking that every movement of the wind outside or of the drip of water was the little pad of his step coming up the flagstones to the door. I was even in the mood when men see unreal things, and twice I thought I saw him passing quickly between my chair and the passage to the further room. But these things are proper to the night, and the strongest thing I suffered for him was in the morning. It was, as you know, very bitterly cold for several days. They found things dead in the hedgerows, and there was perhaps no running water between here and the downs. There was no shelter from the snow. There was no cover for my friend at all. And when I was up at dawn with the faint light about, a driving wind full of sleet filled the air. Then I made certain that the dog Argus was dead, and what was worse, that I should not find his body, that the old dog had got caught in some snare, or that his strength had failed him through the cold, as it fails us human beings also upon such nights, striking at the heart. Though I was certain that I would not see him again, yet I went on foolishly and aimlessly enough, plunging through the snow from one spinney to another, and hoping that I might hear a whine. I heard none, and if the little trail he had made in his departure might have been seen in the evening, long before that morning the drift would have covered it. I had eaten nothing, and yet it was near noon when I returned, pushing forward to the cottage against the pressure of the storm, when I found there, miserably crouched, trembling, half dead, in the lee of a little thick yew beside my door, the dog Argus. And as I came, his tail just wagged, and he just moved his ears, but he had not the strength to come near me, his master. I carried him in and put him here, feeding him by force, and I have restored him. All this the recluse said to me with as deep and as restrained emotion as though he had been speaking of the most sacred things, as indeed for him these things were sacred. It was therefore a mere inadvertence in me, and an untrained habit of thinking aloud, which made me say, "Good heavens, what will you do when the dog Argus dies?" At once I wish I had not said it, for I could see that the recluse could not bear the words. I looked therefore a little awkwardly beyond him, and was pleased to see the dog Argus lazily opening his one eye and surveying me with torpor and with contempt. He was certainly less moved than his master. Then in my heart I prayed that these two, unless the God would make them both immortal and catch them up into whatever place is better than the Weald, or unless he would grant them one death together upon one day, that the dog Argus might survive my friend, and that the recluse might be the first to dissolve that long companionship. For of this I am certain, that the dog would suffer less. For men love their dependents much more than do their dependents them. And this is especially true of brutes, for men are nearer to the gods. End of On a Dog and a Man Also.
Rats by E. Nesbit. Coffee Break Collection 29. Dogs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Rats. "He has no nose," said my master. "He is a handsome dog, but he has no nose." This annoyed me very much, for I have a nose, a very long, sharp, black nose. I wear tan boots and gloves, and my coat is a beautiful, shiny black. I am a Manchester Terrier, and I fulfill the old instructions for such dogs. I am necked like a drake, headed like a snake, tailed like a rat, and footed like a cat. And then they said I had no nose. But Carrie explained to me that my master did not mean to find fault with the shape of my nose, but that what he wanted to be understood was that I had no nose for smelling rats. Carrie has, and he is ridiculously vain of this accomplishment. "And you have no nose, you know, old boy," said Carrie. "Why, you would let the rats run all over you and never know it." I turned up my nose, my beautiful, pointed, handsome nose, and walked away without a word. A few weeks afterwards, my master brought home with him some white rats. Carrie was out at the time, but my master showed me the rats through the bars of their cage. He also showed me a boot and a stick. Although I have no nose, I was clever enough to put two and two together. Did I mention that there were 2 rats? We were not allowed to go in the study, either of us, and my master put the rats there in their cage on the table. That night, when everybody had gone to bed, I said to Carrie, "I may have no nose, old man, but I smell rats." Carrie sniffed contemptuously. "You?" said he, curling himself around in his basket. "I don't believe you could smell an elephant if there were one in the dresser drawer." I kept my temper. "I'm not feeling very well, Carrie," I said gently, "or I would go and see myself. But I am sure there are rats. I smell them plainly. They seem to be in the study." "Go to sleep," he said. "You're dreaming, old man." "Why don't you go and see?" I said. "If I didn't feel so very faint, I would go myself." Carrie got out of his basket reluctantly. "I suppose I ought to go, if you are quite certain," he said, and he went. In less than a minute he returned to the kitchen, trembling all over with excitement. "Chappie," he said, "Chappie." "Well?" "There are rats," he whispered hoarsely. "There are rats in the study." "Did you go in?" I asked. "No, you know we're forbidden to go in, but I smelt them quite plainly. I can't smell them at all here," he said regretfully. "What a nose you have got after all, Chappie." "What are you going to do, Carrie?" I asked. "Why, nothing," he said. "We mustn't go in the study." "Oh," I said, "rules weren't made for great occasions like this. It's your business to kill rats wherever they are." And that misguided, wire-haired person went up. He got them out of the cage and killed them. The next morning, when the master came down, he thrashed Carrie within an inch of his life. He knows I don't touch rats, and besides, I was so unwell that nobody could have suspected me. And I explained to Carrie that, good as my nose is, I couldn't possibly tell by the smell that the rats were white, and therefore sacred. It was not worthwhile to mention that I had seen them before. Carrie looks up to me now as a dog with a nose, and I am much happier than formerly. But Carrie is not nearly so keen on rats now. I thought somehow he wouldn't be. End of Rats. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
The Tables Turned by Edith Nesbit. Coffee Break Collection 29. Dogs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Grazia Tundo, Italy. The Tables Turned. We knew it was a dog. Directly the basket was set down in the hall. We heard it moving about inside. We sniffed all round. We asked it why it didn't come out. The basket was tightly tied up with string. "Are you having a good time in there?" said Roy. "Can't you show your face?" said I. "He's ashamed of it," said Roy, waving his long bushy tail. Then he growled a little, and the dog inside growled too. And then, as Roy had an appointment with the butcher at his own back door, I went out to see him home. "I'm so sorry I'm going away for Christmas with my master," he said when we parted. "But you must introduce that new dog to me when I come home. We mustn't stand any of his impudence, eh?" I was sorry. Roy was going away, for Roy is my great friend. He always fights the battles for both of us. I dare say I might have got into the way of fighting my own battles, but I never like to interfere with anybody's pleasure. And Roy's chief pleasure is fighting. As for me, I think the delights of that recreation are overestimated. When my master came home, he opened the basket, and the dog of Irish family tumbled out, growling and snarling, and hid himself under the sofa. They wasted more biscuits on him than I have ever seen wasted on any deserving dog, and at last they got him out, and he consented to eat some supper. They gave him a much better basket than mine, and we went to bed. Next morning the Irish terrier got out of his basket, stretched himself, yawned, and insisted on thrashing me before breakfast. "But I am a dog of peace," I said. "I don't fight." "But I do, you see," he answered. "That's just the difference." I tried to defend myself, but he got hold of one of my feet and held it up. I sat up and howled with pain and indignation. "Have you had enough?" he said, and without waiting for my answer, proceeded to give me more. "But I don't fight," I said. "I don't approve of fighting." "Then I'll teach you to have better manners than to say so," said he, and he taught me for nearly 5 minutes. "Now then," he said, "are you licked?" "Yes," I answered, for indeed I was. "Are you sorry you ever tried to fight with me?" "Yes," still seemed to be the only thing to say. "And do you approve of fighting?" He seemed to wish me to say yes, and so I said it. "Very well then," he said. "Now we'll be friends, if you like. Come along, you have given me an appetite for breakfast." "Any society worth cultivating about here?" he asked after the meal, in his overbearing way. "I have a very great friend who lives next door," I said, "but I don't know whether I should care to introduce you to him." He showed his teeth, and asked what I meant. "You see, you might not like him, and if you didn't like him, but he's a most agreeable dog—" "A good fighter?" asked the Rustler. I scratched my ear with my hind foot, and pretended to think. "Oh, I see he's not," said the Rustler contemptuously. "Well, you shall introduce him to me directly comes back." Rustler's overbearing and disagreeable manners so upset me that I was quite thin when, at the end of a week, Roy came home. I told him my troubles at once. "Bring your Rustler along," he said grandly, "and introduce him to me." So I did. Rustler came along with his ears up and his miserable tail in the air. Roy lay by his kennel, looking the image of serenity and peacefulness. To judge by his expression, he mightn't have had a tooth in his head. Rustler stood with his feet as far apart as he could get them, and put his head on one side. I've heard so much about you, Mr. What's-your-name, he said, that I've come to make a closer acquaintance. Delighted, I'm sure, said Roy, who has splendid manners. If you will get on your legs, said Rustler rudely, I will tell you what I think of you. Roy got on his legs, still looking very humble, and the next minute he had Rustler by the front foot, and was making him sit down and scream, just as Rustler had made me. It was a magnificent fight. Have you had enough? Said Roy, and then gave him more without waiting for an answer. I don't want to fight any more, said Rustler at last. I'm sorry I spoke. Then I'll teach you to have more pluck than to own it, said Roy. When he had taught him for some time, he said, Are you licked? Yes, said Rustler, glaring at me out his uninjured eye. Are you sorry you tried to fight with me? Yes. Will you promise to leave my little friend here alone? Yes. Then Roy let him go. We shook tails all round, and Rustler and I went home. Poor Rustler, I said, I know exactly how you feel. You little humbug, he said, with half a laugh. For he's not an ill-natured fellow when you come to know him. You managed it very cleverly, and I'm not one to bear malice, but I say, your friend is A1. We are now the most united trio, and Roy and Rustler have licked all the other dogs in the neighborhood. End of The Tables Turned. Recording by Maria Grazia Tundo, Italy.
The Three Dogs by Andrew Lang. Coffee Break Collection 29. Dogs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There was once upon a time a shepherd who had 2 children, a son and a daughter. When he was on his deathbed, he turned to them and said, I have nothing to leave you but 3 sheep and a small house. Divide them between you as you like, but don't quarrel over them, whatever you do. When the shepherd was dead, the brother asked his sister which she would like best, the sheep or the little house. And when she had chosen the house, he said, Then I'll take the sheep and go out to seek my fortune in the wide world. I don't see why I shouldn't be as lucky as many another who has set out on the same search, and it wasn't for nothing that I was born on a Sunday. And so he started on his travels, driving his 3 sheep in front of him, and for a long time it seemed as if fortune didn't mean to favour him at all. One day he was sitting disconsolately at a crossroad when a man suddenly appeared before him with 3 black dogs, each one bigger than the other. Hello, my fine fellow, said the man. I see you have 3 fat sheep. I'll tell you what, if you give them to me, I'll give you my 3 dogs. In spite of his sadness, the youth smiled and replied, What would I do with your dogs? My sheep at least feed themselves, but I should have to find food for the dogs. My dogs are not like other dogs, said the stranger. They will feed you instead of you them, and will make your fortune. The smallest one is called Salt, and will bring you food whenever you wish. The second is called Pepper, and will tear anyone to pieces who offers to hurt you. And the great big strong one is called Mustard, and is so powerful that it will break iron or steel with its teeth. The shepherd at last let himself be persuaded, and gave the stranger his sheep. In order to test the truth of his statement about the dogs, he said at once, Salt, I am hungry, and before the words were out of his mouth the dog had disappeared, and returned in a few minutes with a large basketful of the most delicious food. Then the youth congratulated himself on the bargain he had made, and continued his journey in the best of spirits. One day he met a carriage and pair, all draped in black. Even the horses were covered with black trappings, and the coachman was clothed in crape from top to toe. Inside the carriage sat a beautiful girl in a black dress, crying bitterly. The horses advanced slowly and mournfully, with their heads bent on the ground. Coachman, what is the meaning of all this grief? Asked the shepherd. At first the coachman wouldn't say anything, but when the youth pressed him, he told him that a huge dragon dwelt in the neighbourhood, and required yearly the sacrifice of a beautiful maiden. This year the lot had fallen on the king's daughter,
and the whole country was filled with woe and lamentation in consequence. The shepherd felt very sorry for the lovely maiden and determined to follow the carriage. In a little it halted at the foot of a high mountain. The girl got out and walked slowly and sadly to meet her terrible fate. The coachman perceived that the shepherd wished to follow her, and warned him not to do so if he valued his life. But the shepherd wouldn't listen to his advice. When they had climbed about halfway up the hill, they saw a terrible-looking monster, with the body of a snake, and with huge wings and claws, coming towards them, breathing forth flames of fire, and preparing to seize its victim. Then the shepherd called, "Pepper, come to the rescue," and the second dog set upon the dragon, and after a fierce struggle bit it so sharply in the neck that the monster rolled over, and in a few moments breathed its last. Then the dog ate up the body, all except its 2 front teeth, which the shepherd picked up and put in his pocket. The princess was quite overcome with terror and joy, and fell fainting at the feet of her deliverer. When she recovered her consciousness, she begged the shepherd to return with her to her father, who would reward him richly. But the youth answered that he wanted to see something of the world, and that he would return again in 3 years, and nothing would make him change his resolve. The princess seated herself once more in her carriage, and bidding each other farewell, she and the shepherd separated, she to return home, and he to see the world. But while the princess was driving over a bridge, the carriage suddenly stood still, and the coachman turned round to her and said, "Your deliverer has gone, and doesn't thank you for your gratitude. It would be nice of you to make a poor fellow happy. Therefore you may tell your father that it was I who slew the dragon, and if you refuse to, I will throw you into the river, and no one will be any the wiser, for they will think the dragon has devoured you." The maiden was in a dreadful state when she heard these words, but there was nothing for her to do but to swear that she would give out the coachman as her deliverer, and not to divulge the secret to anyone. So they returned to the capital, and everyone was delighted when they saw the princess had returned unharmed. The black flags were taken down from all the palace towers, and gay-coloured ones put up in their place. And the king embraced his daughter and her supposed rescuer with tears of joy, and turning to the coachman he said, "You have not only saved the life of my child, but you have also freed the country from a terrible scourge. Therefore it is only fitting that you should be richly rewarded. Take therefore my daughter for your wife, but as she is still so young, do not let the marriage be celebrated for another year." The coachman thanked the king for his graciousness, and was then led away to be richly dressed and instructed in the arts and graces that befitted his new position. But the poor princess wept bitterly, though she did not dare to confide her grief to anyone. When the year was over, she begged so hard for another year's respite that it was granted to her. But this year passed also, and she threw herself at her father's feet and begged so piteously for 1 more year that the king's heart was melted, and he yielded to her request, much to the princess's joy, for she knew that her real deliverer would appear at the end of the 3rd year. And so the year passed away like the other 2, and the wedding day was fixed, and all the people were prepared to feast and make merry. But on the wedding day it happened that a stranger came to the town with 3 black dogs. He asked what the meaning of all the feasting and fuss was, and they told him that the king's daughter was just to be married to the man who had slain the terrible dragon. The stranger at once denounced the coachman as a liar, but no one would listen to him, and he was seized and thrown into a cell with iron doors. While he was lying on his straw pallet, pondering mournfully on his fate, he thought he heard the low whining of his dogs outside, and an idea dawned on him, and he called out as loudly as he could, "Mustard, come to my help," and in a second he saw the paws of the biggest dog at the window of his cell, and before he could count 2, the creature had bitten through the iron bars and stood beside him. Then they both let themselves out of the prison by the window, and the poor youth was free once more, though he felt very sad when he thought that another was to enjoy the reward that rightfully belonged to him. He felt hungry too, so he called his dog Salt, and asked him to bring home some food. The faithful creature trotted off and soon returned with a table napkin full of the most delicious food, and the napkin itself was embroidered with a kingly crown. The king had just seated himself at the wedding feast with all his court when the dog appeared and licked the princess's hand in an appealing manner. With a joyful start she recognized the beast and bound her own table napkin round his neck. Then she plucked up her courage and told her father the whole story. The king at once sent a servant to follow the dog, and in a short time the stranger was led into the king's presence. The former coachman grew as white as a sheet when he saw the shepherd, and falling on his knees begged for mercy and pardon. The princess recognized her deliverer at once, and did not need the proof of the 2 dragons' teeth, which he drew from his pocket. The coachman was thrown into a dark dungeon, and the shepherd took his place at the princess's side, and this time, you may be sure, she did not beg for the wedding to be put off. The young couple lived for some time in great peace and happiness, when suddenly one day the former shepherd bethought himself of his poor sister and expressed a wish to see her again, and to let her share in his good fortune. So they sent a carriage to fetch her, and soon she arrived at the court and found herself once more in her brother's arms. Then one of the dogs spoke and said, "Our task is done. You have no more need of us. We only waited to see that you did not forget your sister in your prosperity." And with these words, the 3 dogs became 3 birds and flew away into the heavens. Grimm's Fairy Tales. End of the 3 dogs.
Tinker by E. Nesbit. Coffee Break Collection 29. Dogs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tinker. My name is Stumps, and my mistress is rather a nice little girl, but she has her faults, like most people. I myself, as it happens, am wonderfully free from faults. Among my mistress's faults is what I may call a lack of dignity, joined to a desire to make other people undignified too. You will hardly believe that before I had belonged to her a month, she had made me learn to dance and to jump. I am a very respectable dachshund of cobby build, and jumping is the very last exercise I should have taken to of my own accord. But when Miss Daisy said, "Now jump, Stumps, there's a darling," and held out her little arms, I could not well refuse, for after all, the child is my mistress. I never could understand why the cat was not taught to dance. It seemed to me very hard that when I was having those long miserable lessons, the cat should be allowed to sit down doing nothing but smile at my misfortunes. Trap always said we ought to feel honored by being taught, and the reason why Pussy wasn't asked to learn was because she was so dreadfully stupid, and had no brains for anything but the pleasures of the chase and the cares of the family. But I didn't think that could be the reason, because the doll was taught to dance, though she never learned, and I am sure she was stupid enough. Another thing which Miss Daisy taught me to do was to beg, and the action fills me with shame and pain every time I perform it, and as the years go on, I hate it more and more. For a stout, middle-aged dog, the action is absurd and degrading. Yet such is the force of habit that I go through the performance now quite naturally whenever I want anything. Trap does it too, and says, "What does it matter?" But then he has no judgment, and besides, he's thin. But one of the most thoughtless things my little mistress ever did was one day last summer when she was out without me. I chose to stay at home because it was very hot, and I knew that the roads would be dusty. And she was only going down to the village shop, where no one ever thinks of offering a dog anything to drink. If she had been going to the farm, I should have gone with her, because the lady there shows proper attention to visitors, and always sets down a nice dish of milk for us dogs. Besides, I was a little unwell just then. The family had had duck for dinner, and I always feel a little faint after duck. All our family do. So I stayed at home. Well, Miss Daisy had gone out with only Trap and her hoop. I wish I had been there, for Trap is far too easygoing, and a hoop never gives any advice worth listening to. Trap told me all about it as well as he could. Trap can't tell a story very well, poor fellow. It seems that, as Miss Daisy went across the village green, she saw a crowd of children running after a dog with, I hardly like to mention such a thing, a tin saucepan tied to his tail. The dog bolted into the empty dog kennel by the blacksmith shop and stayed there growling. "Go away, bad children," said Miss Daisy. "How dare you treat a poor dear doggie so?" The children wouldn't go away at first. "Very well," said Miss Daisy. "I shall tell Trap what I think of you all." Then she whispered to Trap, and he began to growl so fiercely that the children dared not come nearer. Anyone can growl. Presently the children got tired of listening to him and went away. Then Miss Daisy coaxed the unpleasant, tin-tailed creature out of the kennel, and untied the string and took off the pan. Then, if you'll believe a dog of my character, and of course you must, she carried that low dog home in her arms, and washed him and set him down to eat out of the same plate as Trap and myself. Trap was friends with him directly. Some people have no spirit, but I hope I know my duty to myself too well for that. I snarled at the base intruder till he was quite ashamed of himself. I knew from the first that he'd be taught jumping and begging and things like that. I hate those things myself, but that's no reason why every low dog should be taught them. Miss Daisy called him Tinker, because he once carried a tin pan about with him, and she tried very hard to make me friendly to him. But I can choose my own friends, I hope. Everyone made a great fuss about one thing he did, but actually it was nothing but biting. And if biting isn't natural to a dog, I should like to know what is. And why people should be praised and petted and have new collars and everybody else's share of the bones, only for doing what is quite natural to them, I have never been able to comprehend. Besides, barking is as good as biting any day, and I'm sure I barked enough, though it wasn't my business. Miss Daisy had gone away to stay with her cousins in London, and she had taken Trap with her. Why she should have taken him instead of me is a matter on which I can offer no opinion. If my opinion had been asked, I should have said that I thought it more suitable for her to have a heavy middle-aged dog of good manners than a harum-scarum young stripling like Trap. Trap told me afterwards that he thought the reason he was taken was because Miss Daisy would have had more to pay for the dog ticket of such a heavy dog as I am. But I can't believe that dogs are charged for by the weight, like butter. As I was saying, Miss Daisy took Trap with her, and also her father and mother, and Tinker and I were left to take care of the servants. We had a very agreeable time, though I confess that I missed Miss Daisy more than I would have believed possible. But there was more to eat in the kitchen than usual, and the servants often left things on the table when they went out to take in the milk or to chat with the gardeners. And if people leave things on tables, they have only themselves to thank for whatever happens. There was a young man who wore a fur cap, and who used to call with fish. And I was more surprised than I care to own when I met him walking out with Cook one Sunday afternoon, for I thought she had a soul above fish. Yet, when the servants began to ask this young man to tea in the kitchen, I thought, of course, it must be all right. But Tinker would do nothing but growl the whole time the young man was there, so that at last Cook had to lock us up in the butler's pantry till the young man was gone. I had not growled, but I was locked in too. The world is full of injustice and ingratitude. Now, one night, when the servants went to bed, Tinker and I lay down in our baskets under the hall table, as usual. But Tinker was dreadfully restless, which must have been only an accident, because he said himself he didn't know what was the matter with him. And he would not go to sleep, but kept walking up and down as if he were going to hide a bone and couldn't find a good place for it. "Do lie down for goodness sake, Tinker," I said, "and go to sleep. Anyone can see you have not been brought up in a house where regular hours are kept. I can't go to sleep. I don't know what's the matter with me, he said gloomily. Well, I tried to go to sleep myself, and I think I must almost have dropped off when I heard a scraping from the butler's pantry. I wasn't going to bark. It wasn't my business. I have often heard Miss Daisy's relations say that I was no house dog. Still, I think Tinker ought to have barked then, but he didn't, only just pricked his ears and his tail, and he waited, and the scraping went on. Then Tinker said to me, "Don't you make a noise for your life. I am going to see what it is." And he trotted softly into the butler's pantry. It was rather dark, but you know we dogs can see as well as cats in the dark, although they do make such a fuss about it and declare that they are the only creatures who can. There was a man outside the window, and I tapped Tinker with my tail to show him that he ought to bark, but he never moved. The man had been scraping and scraping till he had got out one of the window panes. It was a very little window pane, only just big enough for his hand to go through, and the man took out the window pane and put his hand through, making a long arm to get at the fastening of the window, and just as he was going to undo the hasp, Tinker made a spring on the window ledge, and he caught the man's hand in his mouth. And the man gave a push, and Tinker fell off the window ledge, but he took the man's hand with him, and there was the man's arm dragged through the window pane, and Tinker hanging onto his fingers. The man broke some more panes and tried to get his other hand through, and if he had, he would have done for Tinker, but he could not manage it, and now I thought, this is the time to bark. And I barked. I barked my best. I barked nobly, though I am not a house dog, and I don't think it's my business. In less than a minute, down came the gardener and the under gardener, and Tinker was still holding on, and they took the man, and he was marched off to prison. And it turned out to be the man in the fur cap. But though they made fuss enough about Tinker's share in the business, you may be sure it didn't make me think much more of him. I should never have had anything to say to him but for one thing. Early one morning, we 3 dogs, it's all over long ago, and I hope I can be generous and let bygones be bygones, he is one of us now, went out for a run in the paddock by the wood, and while Trap and I were trotting up and down, chatting about the weather, that Tinker dog bolted into the wood, and in less than a minute came out with a rabbit. I saw at once that he could never get it eaten before Miss Daisy came out, and I knew that, if he were found with it, his sufferings would be awful. So I helped him to eat it. I know my duty to a fellow creature, I trust. It was a very young rabbit, and tender, not too much fur. Fur gets in your throat and spoils your teeth besides. We had just finished it when my mistress came out. Trap would not eat a bit, even to help Tinker out of his scrape, but I have a kind heart. Well, after that I thought I might as well consent to be friends with Tinker, in spite of his low breeding. You see, I had helped him out of a dreadful scrape, and one always feels kindly to people one has helped. He has caught several more rabbits since then, and I've always stood by him on those occasions, and I always mean to. I am not one to turn my back on a friend, I believe. So now he has a collar like ours, and I hardly feel degraded at all when I sit opposite to him at the dolls' tea parties. End of Tinker by E. Nesbit. Recording by Andrea Milliken.
Tuffy Todd's Adventure, A True Story by Samuel Doggerel. Coffee Break Collection 29, Dogs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tuffy Todd's Adventure. There is a little dog whose name is Tuffy Todd, who has the same wise look as many a dog you've met, and is a well-bred house dog pet. but quaintly called in rhyme a hound, to please the poet's ear for sound. Round as a mole he's fat and fair, and robed in coat of whitest hair. His soft brown eyes are bright and clear, his little ears are quick to hear. He has a kind expressive face, with every feature full of grace. In disposition meek and mild, he's gentle as a little child, but has his own peculiar way, as all who hear will surely say. He is to people so polite, you'd think he'd never bark or bite, but strangers climbing up the hill will shout in vain, "You hound, be still!" And traveller late in midnight dark is sure to hear Tuff's loudest bark, while tramps who come about the yard must flee or face a valiant guard. Although he has a host of friends, to them he rarely condescends, and their caresses kindly made are with indifference coldly paid. He lives for Master Orrin Todd, and worships him as household god. With him Tuff wildly romps and plays, and from his side but seldom strays. At times when Orrin goes away, to tarry but a single day, he bids his Tuffy stay behind, and try to have a peaceful mind. But Tuff, so sad and desolate, lies down alone to meditate, or seeks the porch a sunny place, to watch for Todd's returning face, or wait until the voice so dear shall fall like music on his ear. Unmoved by other sight or sound, he lies as if in thought profound. Call him, he seems both deaf and dumb, unless you say, "Ho, Orrin's come!" when quick like one from sleep he springs, and flies as swift as bird on wings, to meet his master and his friend. Then Tuffy's morning has an end. His ways eccentric may appear, but in the sequel they'll be clear. Now little Tuff, it may seem strange, had lived at home, nor thought of change. But one calm morning, clear and bright, as if new visions filled his sight, to Griffin's Corners begged a ride, in Orrin's wagon by his side. Good Master Todd could not deny the pleading of poor Tuffy's eye, and said, "Jump in and take a seat, and you shall have a royal treat, for though we go by mountain road, and do not want a heavy load, our sprightly horses, strong and true, will never mind a mite like you." Then Tuff leaped in and sat erect, as if to show his intellect, when off they rode with hearts of glee, and warmer friends you rarely see. Now Orrin thought it would be nice to give his Tuffy some advice. "Be careful, Tuffy mine," said he, "we go where many dangers be. Turn not aside, nor leave my track, till setting sun shall warn us back. In town you will a stranger be. Again I say, go not from me." To which the simple dog replied, "Oh, never will I leave thy side, but follow where thy footsteps lead, thou dearest friend in time of need. Our Tuff can talk, like dogs of old, of whom in fable Aesop told." Then Todd, to pass away the time, thus entertained his guest in rhyme. "I've always made you stay at home, and never let you widely roam, because I feared you might be lost, and by the world be rudely tossed, or lest in some unlucky way you might be hurt, as one that day, that doleful, direful day, when life and death seemed balanced in the strife. You then were but a little pup, and with a snail could scarce keep up, but seeing Flora's gentle pace, you thought with her you'd run a race. And as she moved along the road, and pulled with care her heavy load, you chanced to fall beneath the wheel, which crushed your leg and made you reel. Oh, dreadful sight! Oh, fearful cry! A mangled limb, no surgeon nigh. I stanched the blood which freely flowed, and in my arms, a tiny load, I bore you safely to our door, then said, 'You shall go out no more until your leg is fully healed, or death shall take you from the field. I set and bandaged well your limb. Should surgeon doubt, I'd challenge him, and laid you on an easy bed, and saw that you were kindly fed. I closely watched you night and day, and did not fail for you to pray. When you had reached the 3rd long week, thank God, with reverence do I speak, 'twas plain you needed nothing more than just to walk about the floor. At length, when people thought you dead, you left your room and little bed. He's tough, they said, as hickory rod, and called you Tough, then Tuffy Todd. And as you see it strangely came, you have a soft and pretty name. Now, since to perfect health restored, to thank me well you can afford. Tough answered, Do you doubt, dear friend, that I shall thank you to the end? Since I was struck by will so rude, have I not shown you gratitude? Have I not always been to you obedient, faithful, good, and true? Through evil and through good report, I've never failed in my support. Forsaking friends, let none deny, for you I've lived, for you I'll die. What care I for the world around, when all my joy in you is found? Please pardon if too bold I seem, and hold me firm in your esteem. I did not mean to grieve your heart, good Duff, nor cause a single smart, but just to have a little play, I thought I'd see what you would say in answer to my sober talk, while slow the horses onward walk. Conversing thus as friend with friend, at last they reach their journey's end. Todd's heart with anxious fears beset, foreboding peril to his pet. He turns to Tuffy. You've been warned, in language clear and unadorned, to stay by me and to beware of dangers lurking everywhere, although no prophet born or bred, though on my mind no light is shed. I fear from knowledge of your race, the day will end in your disgrace. Out jumped brave Tuff and Farmer Todd, but scarce had gone a single rod, before they heard, Bow wow, friend Tuff, for that's your name, I'm sure enough. How glad I am to see your face, and give to you a friend's embrace. Now while in town, stay thou with me, and boon companions we will be. Then Tuff, poor innocent abroad, who never dreamed of any fraud, replied, Perhaps we've met before. I'll take your word and ask no more. It would not seem polite, I know, should I refuse with you to go. Away they marched as large as life, their hearts with hope and pleasure rife, and wandered in their heedless play through many a dark and devious way. Unchecked they raced and chased around, a lawless cur and recreant hound. They took no note of time, nor cared how far they strayed, nor how they fared, for Tuff could not foresee his woes till darkness did around him close. O Tuffy, born and reared in ease, with bread enough to eat and cheese, where now thy master's tender care, where now the bed thou erst didst share? Thy new-made friend all false will be in time of thy adversity. Upon the cold, cold ground to-night no sleep shall come ere morning light, nor morsel sweet for hungry maw, nor peace for nature's broken law. The westering sun had low declined, when homeward with an easy mind good Orin turned his horse's feet, expecting there his dog to meet. But drawing near, no Tuff was found to greet him with accustomed sound. Poor Orin could not sleep a wink, but lay awake all night to think how sad the fate of Tuff might be, who late was in prosperity. Back in the early morning bright, to Griffin's Orin took his flight, but thoughts of Tuff so filled his mind, no other thought a place could find. And as he passed to each neighbour's door, 'twas little known the load he bore. The dogs ran out and barked so bold, they wakened echoes in the wold, while ducks and geese joined in the strife, and quacked and screamed for their dear life. Then proudly crowed vain Chanticleer, I am, you see, without a peer. Let none within my realm intrude, to scare my hens and little brood. But patient kine in farmyard penned were mute with meek-eyed wonderment, while grazing sheep on hillside near heard all and said, "We need not fear." Each mother called her own dear lamb, who answered back, "Oh, here I am." The squirrel with his nimble feet how quickly found a safe retreat, and from the wall or limb on high peeped slyly out as Todd went by. The birds from out the leafy trees, so gently swayed by morning breeze, poured forth their notes in merry lay, and sang "Good speed and happy day." And insect world on joyous wing in sunlight clear did sweetly sing, or hum in myriad tones so gay, we cheer the traveller on his way. But ferns and flowers in wayside beds with meek surprise did lift their heads, and whisper low, "Our friend's in haste, and has no time on us to waste." In days gone by he'd stop a while to praise our charms and make us smile, or take us in his gentle hands as if rare gifts from foreign lands. And thus each loving, living thing had kindly thought or word to bring, which proved a balm to soothe Todd's soul as he moved onward to his goal. The livelong day, through street and lane, he sought his dog, but sought in vain. From house to house he asked each man, "Where's Tuff? Pray tell me if you can." "Why, Tuff has gone with Bruno Brown, a dog," they said, "of poor renown." It was enough to turn one's brain to always hear this sad refrain. Retracing now in twilight drear his weary steps, Todd dropped a tear, and took with heavy heart the way his feet had pressed at opening day, and walked in doubt and gloom along, where late he sang his cheerful song, where frisked his faithful dog with glee, and kept him joyful company. Poor Tuff, a wanderer forlorn, now loud bewailed that he was born. For though in darkness and in grief there came no friend to his relief, but being born he did not care just then to die. With reason rare he searched along the dusty ground to see where footprints could be found, when he with keen instinctive nose discerned the course of Orwin's toes. Then light and hope began to rise and cheer the darkness of his skies, while slow he kept the lonely road which led him safe to his abode. Scarce 12 had struck the kitchen clock, when lo! was heard a scratch or knock. "Oh," said his wife, "oh, Orwin dear, the lost is found, our Tuff is here." Then up sprang Orwin with a bound, and welcomed home his truant hound, whose downcast eye and trembling frame betrayed a sense of guilt and shame. But Todd, in sweet forgiving mood, spread Tuff a couch and gave him food, and bade him now find rest in sleep, and thus forget his sorrows deep. Then Tuff in silence ate his meal, but made by looks this sad appeal, "O friend in sorrow and in cheer, there is none on earth as you so dear. For all the trouble I have brought, I am not worthy of your thought, and would receive a just return, should you my presence coldly spurn, or from me turn with angry frown, and let me in despair sink down. I will not plead in self-defense, nor try to prove my innocence, but truth requires that I should say how I was duped and led astray by a cunning dog, who boldly claimed he'd seen my home ere I was named, had heard of Tuffy Todd before, when passing by our cottage door. He led me captive at his will, and made me suffer direst ill, which was no more than I deserved, who from the path of duty swerved. I have my sins and woes confessed, and ask forgiveness, peace, and rest. O grant the mercy which I crave, or I shall find an early grave." To such petition, all unused, with faltering words and eyes suffused, kind Orwin made his brief reply, "The same true friends are you and I, as we have ever been before. We will be now and evermore. And since you mourn the first offence with deep and humble penitence, I grant forgiveness full and free, and trust no lapse again to see. To banish care and doubt and fear, and waken hope and faith and cheer, good Orin, with a tact supreme, from great to small then changed his theme. My dog, quoth he, with morning sun, I'll see what can for you be done. There comes just now this happy thought, for you a collar shall be bought, that if perchance you go astray, you will be known, though far away. On it must be inscribed your name, and Latin words to give you fame. Nil desperandum they shall be, and from despair may you be free. What more did pass between these friends? The curtain now around descends. Their mutual joys, their mutual woes, the poet's pen may not disclose. To dog and master both so true, long life and peace and our adieu. Now turning from the gay or sad, this moral we will simply add. Ye maidens fair and comely youth, accept the words of love and truth. Not all is gold with golden gleam, not all are friends who friendly seem. The tried, the trusted, and the true, these are the friends we name for you. End of Tuffy Todd's adventure.
The Vagabonds by J.T. Trowbridge. Coffee Break Collection 29. Dogs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rowan Puttergill. The Vagabonds. We are two travellers, Roger and I. Roger's my dog. Come here, you scamp. Jump for the gentleman. Mind your eye. Over the table. Look out for the lamp. The rogue is growing a little old. 5 years we've tramped through winter and weather, and slept outdoors when nights were cold, and ate and drank and starved together. We've learned what comfort is, I tell you. A bed on the floor, a bit of rosin, a fire to thaw our thumbs. Poor fellow, the paw he holds up there has been frozen. Plenty of catgut for my fiddle. This outdoor business is bad for strings. Then a few nice buckwheats hot from the griddle, and Roger and I set up for kings. No thank ye, sir, I never drink. Roger and I are exceedingly moral, aren't we, Roger? See him wink. Well, something hot then, we won't quarrel. He's thirsty too, see him nod his head. What a pity, sir, that dogs can't talk. He understands every word that's said, and he knows good milk from water and chalk. The truth is, sir, now I reflect, I've been so sadly given to grog, I wonder I've not lost the respect he has to you, sir, even of my dog. But he sticks by through thick and thin, and this old coat, with its empty pockets and rags that smell of tobacco and gin, he'll follow while he has eyes in his sockets. There isn't another creature living would do it, and prove through every disaster, so fond, so faithful, and so forgiving to such a miserable, thankless master. No, sir, see him wag his tail and grin. By George, it makes my old eyes water. That is, there's something in this gin that chokes a fellow. But no matter. We'll have some music if you're willing, and Roger, what a plague of coughers, sir, shall march a little. Start, you villain, paws up, eyes front, salute your officer. About face, attention, take your rifle. Some dogs have arms, you see. Now hold your cap while the gentlemen give a trifle to aid a poor old patriot soldier. March. Halt. Now show how the rebel shakes when he stands up to hear his sentence. Now tell us how many drams it takes to honour a jolly new acquaintance. 5 yelps, that's 5, he's mighty knowing. The night's before us, fill the glasses. Quick, sir, I'm ill. My brain is going. Some brandy. Thank you. There, it passes. Why not reform? That's easily said. But I've gone through such wretched treatment, sometimes forgetting the taste of bread, and scarce remembering what meat meant, that my poor stomach's past reform, and there are times when, mad with thinking, I'd sell out heaven for something warm to prop a horrible inward sinking. Is there a way to forget to think, At your age, sir, home, fortune, friends, dear girl's love, but I took to drink. The same old story, you know how it ends. If you could have seen these classic features, you needn't laugh, sir, they were not then such a burning libel on God's creatures. I was one of your handsome men. If you had seen her, so fair and young, whose head was happy on this breast, if you could have heard the songs I sung, when the wine went round, you wouldn't have guessed that ever I, sir, should be straying from door to door, with fiddle and dog, ragged and penniless, and playing to you to-night for a glass of grog. She's married since, a parson's wife. 'Twas better for her that we should part, better the soberest, prosiest life, than a blasted home and a broken heart. I have seen her? Once. I was weak and spent, on the dusty road a carriage stopped, but little she dreamed as on she went, who kissed the coin that her fingers dropped. You've set me talking, sir. I'm sorry. It makes me wild to think of the change. What do you care for a beggar's story? Is it amusing? You find it strange? I had a mother, so proud of me, 'twas well she died before. Do you know, if the happy spirits in heaven can see the ruin and wretchedness here below? Another glass, and strong, to deaden this pain, then Roger and I will start. I wonder, has he such a lumpish, leaden, aching thing in place of a heart? He is sad sometimes, and would weep if he could, no doubt remembering things that were, a virtuous kennel with plenty of food, and himself a sober, respectable cur. I'm better now. That glass was warming. You rascal, limber your lazy feet. We must be fiddling and performing for supper and bed, or starve in the street. Not a very gay life to lead, you think, but soon we shall go where lodgings are free, and the sleepers need neither victuals nor drink. The sooner the better for Roger and me. End of The Vagabonds.
The Vain Setter by Edith Nesbit, Coffee Break Collection 29, Dogs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Grazia Tundo, Italy. The Vain Setter. Ours is one of the most ancient and noble families in the land, and I contend that family pride is an exalted sentiment. I still hold to this belief, in spite of all the sufferings that it has brought upon me. My father, whose ancestor came over with the Conqueror, has taken prizes at many a county show, and my mother, the handsomest of her sex, took one prize, and would have taken more but for the unfortunate accident of having her tail cut off in a door. I early determined to be worthy of my high breeding and undoubted descent. A setter should have long silky ears. I made my brother pull mine gently for an hour at a time. In order to lengthen them, I combed their fringes with my paws. My father's brow is lofty and narrow. The unfortunate accident which removed my mother from public life suggested to me a way of cultivating our most famous family characteristic. I used to place my head between the doorpost and the door, while my brother leaned gently against the latter, so as to press my skull to the requisite shape. My legs, I knew, ought to be straight. I never indulged in any of those field sports to which my brother early turned a light-hearted attention, for I knew that undue exercise tends to curve the legs. My tail was my special care. Regardless of comfort, I twisted myself into the shape of a capital O, and, holding the end of my tail gently but firmly in my teeth, I stretched myself and it. So much pains devoted to such a noble object couldn't be thrown away. I became the handsomest setter in 3 counties. My brother, in the meantime, grew expert in the coarse sporting exercises to which he devoted his energies. He had no pride. He tramped the mud of the fields. He tore his ears in bramble bushes. And I've seen him, so far, lose all sense of our family's dignity, as to grovel at the feet of his master, and raise one of his paws to indicate that birds were near, common birds. I believe they are called partridges. You might as well, I said to him bitterly, you might as well have been born a pointer. Why not? He said. I know a pointer. He went on, laughing in his merry, careless way. I know a pointer who lives at the Pines farm. A capital fellow he is. My dear boy, I said, just come and squeeze my head in the door a little, will you? And let me tell you that for one of our family to associate with a pointer is social ruin. Common, coarse, smooth-coated persons, related, I should suppose, to the vulgar plum-pudding dog. My brother only laughed, but he was a good-natured fellow, and pitched my head in the door until my forehead could stand the strain no longer. I was sent to the Crystal Palace Dog Show, and as I looked round on the hundreds of dogs of all families and nationalities, I breathed a sigh of contentment, and blessed the fate that had made me, in this England of ours, a well-born English setter. My brother was not at the show, of course, but I think even he would have admired me if he could have seen how far superior I was to all about me. Of course, I took the first prize. My mission was fulfilled. My family pride was satisfied. The judges unanimously pronounced me to be the most perfect and beautiful sporting dog in the whole show. My master, wild with delight, patted my silky forehead, and then turned aside to talk with a stout gentleman in gaiters. I thought of what my life would be. One long, joyous round of shows, applause, pats on the head from a grateful master, delicious food and first prizes. But my master's base nature, his ancestors came over with George and the Hanoverians, struck all my hopes to the ground. I woke from my dream of triumph to find myself sold to the stout man in gaiters. I never saw my brother again, was never able to tell my fond and doting mother that I, like her, had taken a prize. I was never able to chat with my father over a bone, comparing with him experiences of the show bench. The stout, gaitered man took me away into a far country. The next morning he took me out into the fields and looked at me from time to time, as if he expected me to do something. Unwilling to disappoint him, I sat down and began my usual exercise for lengthening my tail. He at once struck me violently. We went a little further, and I noticed that it looked more and more displeased, but I couldn't imagine what it could be that so distressed him. Presently one of those common partridge birds had the impertinence to fly out close to me. I caught it at once, and looked round for applause. There only came another shower of blows. "What's the good of your taking prizes," he said, "if you're such an idiot in the field? Might as well have a greyhound." "I wish you had," I said under my breath. I spent a week in torment, and then it occurred to me that this low-born, gaitered person would have been better pleased with my brother. So I tried to recall the tricks with which my brother had particularly aggravated me. And the next time I smelt a partridge, I lay down, as I had seen my brother do, and lifted a foolish foot. I was rewarded with a pat and encouragement. I have now sunk entirely to my brother's level. My master pronounces me to be a most excellent sporting dog, but I shall never forget the blows and angry words that were necessary to make me renounce my ideal of what the setter should be. And deep in my heart I still cherish, with passionate devotion, my views on duty and my honourable family pride. End of The Vain Setter.
Yaller, Burglar-Hunting Dog of the Police Force, by Anonymous. Coffee Break Collection 29, Dogs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Yaller, Burglar-Hunting Dog of the Police Force. From the New York Times, January 12, 1902. It is just a dozen years since Yaller became a member of the New York police force. This is how it all came about. Doorman Frank Goodrich of the Eldridge Street Police Station, Yaller's best friend, tells the story. One day, about 12 years ago, said Goodrich, a man rushed into the station and told us that a mad dog was raising all kinds of trouble in a saloon around the corner. With Patrolman Jack Gallagher, I went to investigate. There we found a little dog behind a chair, snarling and snapping, and we both agreed instantly that he was mad beyond a doubt. Gallagher got his revolver ready, and I pulled the chair from in front of the dog. Just as Gallagher was about to pull the trigger, we spied a tin can tied to the dog's tail. That dog wasn't shot that day, and before we left, we gave the crowd in that saloon to understand in the plainest words possible that the dog had a right to be mad. We then cut the string to which the can was tied, and Gallagher patted the poor little cur, all the time saying kind words until he quit snarling. The dog followed us to the station. He's been here ever since, and today he is the smartest police dog in this or any other town. So you want me to tell you some of the things that Yaller has done since he joined the force, and every word true? About 4 years ago, the police of this station had a lot of trouble with a gang who made it their business to tap penny in the slot machines. Yaller was making his rounds one night when he ran across 2 of the tappers, and he knew in a minute what was up. Before those 2 thieves could turn around, he had one by the leg of the trousers, biting for all he was worth. One fellow would pull him off, and then he would grab the other, barking between times. Presently, one of the policemen on duty heard his bark and hurried to the scene of the trouble. The thieves were too busy fighting with Yaller to notice the cops coming, and in a jiffy were roped in and afterward convicted. On another occasion, about 3 years ago, Yaller, assisted by another dog, since dead, captured a couple of burglars in the slickest manner possible. The burglars were operating along Stanton Street. On this particular night, Yaller caught them at work. He gave chase, and the burglars went upstairs and made their way to the yard, behind the tenement through the skylight, and down the fire escape. Yaller, of course, with his partner, couldn't go through any skylight or down a fire escape. So both hurried downstairs and going into the backyard found the crooks. In a minute they were barking loud enough to raise the dead. The cops heard the barking, followed the sound, and caught the burglars. This was another conviction for Yaller. One of Yaller's most meritorious adventures took place when Devery was captain of this precinct. One of the plainclothes men at that time was John Foley. Foley was chasing a couple of fellows one night, with Yaller assisting him. There was a big hole on Forsyth Street, near Grand, and no light to show where it was. Into the hole Foley fell and sprained his ankle, leaving him senseless on the ground. Yaller, when he saw how helpless Foley was, came back to the station and raised a row, running every minute or so toward the door. I knew that he had something to tell, and the sergeant detailed a man to follow the dog, who went straight to the hole. Foley was taken out and sent to a hospital. Here's something that happened in Commissioner Grant's time. A policeman named Sullivan was up before the commissioner on charges. When the commissioner called for Sullivan's witnesses, Yaller stepped to the front. "What's that dog doing here?" the commissioner said as soon as he saw Yaller. "It's Sullivan's witness," said a cop in the back row, and then Grant heard the story of Yaller's life. "Case dismissed," said the commissioner, and Sullivan and Yaller went back to Eldridge Street. As a fire dog, Yaller is as good as the best of them. Let him be asleep in the station. It makes no difference how sound. If an engine whistles or a bell rings, he is up and away in less time than it takes me to say it. Straight to the fire he goes, and into the house with the firemen and police. He will jump against the room doors, wake up the people inside, and then chase him downstairs. Not many years ago, Yaller got into a tenement which was on fire, and began chasing the people downstairs. He got them all out except one old woman, who was too scared to know which way to go. Finally, he managed to get the poor old creature to the top of the stairs, and getting behind her so she couldn't get back, he began to bark. A policeman heard him, went up the stairs, and brought the woman down. This took place on Allen Street. Yaller can smell a fire quicker than any dog that ever breathed. Let him be strolling around and just get a sniff. In a minute he is at the door of that house, and a racket such as is not often heard around this neighborhood is certain to begin. When it comes to signals, Yaller knows 'em all. He knows every rap in the department, and can trace one quicker than any policeman on the New York force. If Yaller is around and a rap is made, that dog knows the minute he hears it exactly what kind it is, whether the cop wants assistance or whether the roundsman is calling for the man on beat. If the copper's off his beat and the roundsman signals for him and Yaller hears the signal, you can bet your last dollar the dog is going to find a way to let the copper know that there is something doing, without the roundsman knowing anything about it. One of the funny things about Yaller is this: he won't have anything to do with anybody unless he's in the uniform of the New York Police Department. That's why he don't take to inspectors and captains. They wear citizens' clothes too much. We have had a lot of captains at this station since Yaller came, and among them all there was only one he had anything to do with, and that was Captain, now Inspector, Moses Courtwright. All of the others, among them Devery, Herlihy, Hogan, Chapman, Titus, and Walsh, came and went away without getting on the good side of the dog, simply because they wore citizens' clothes so much. Lastly, as to Yaller, I will say that he always picks out some special man to run with. Just now it's Grancher, and whenever Grancher goes on duty, it makes no difference what time of day or night, Yaller goes with him, and don't come back until Grancher's relieved. When his partner happens to be transferred, though, he don't go, but stays right here in his old home and looks over the men left behind, picks out one who suits him, and runs with him until he's transferred. Then he takes up with somebody else. Sponge cake is the one morsel on earth that Yaller likes above all things. He will eat other food, of course, but if there is a piece of cake of the sponge variety lying around loose, he is contented so long as there are no burglars to be caught or fires to go to. Yaller won't have his picture taken. He despises a camera, and it would take a regiment to hold him in position for a snapshot. End of Yaller, Burglar-Hunting Dog of the Police Force. Recording by Colleen McMahon.